Chapter 494. It was funny that 300,000 Shenlin Jun's reserve soldiers were suppressed by 35,000 soldiers. No matter how many waves of counterattacks they organized, as long as they hit the 5,000 veteran soldiers of Fallen Star Army, all the attacks would be turned into nothing. Instead, they were pushed forward step by step by the opponent, gradually losing the geographical advantage of Weha City. Even the speed of shrinking the front line was accelerating. The way to deal with a fierce general was very simple. Let him be arrogant, go deep into the enemy's territory alone, and then encircle and kill him. But facing 5,000 fierce generals at the same time, as well as Gao Buzhan, who was one level higher than the fierce generals, could be said to be a peerless fierce general, and had extremely rich war experience, it was indeed a bit difficult for these little bastards. Looking at the whole Shenwu dynasty, only those old brothers in the past could compete with the 5,000 veteran soldiers of Fallen Star Army. But after decades, not everyone was as bad as Gao Buzhan and was excluded by the higher-ups. A small number of them retired and returned to their hometown. For example, the 5,000 soldiers of Fallen Star Army brought by Yan Xingqi were not implicated, but they were not willing to work for Lei Qiusheng. Most of them had now entered the army of Shenwu dynasty, and even held positions in the Ministry of War of the Imperial Court, and became important, big shots. After years of living like royalty, how much courage could they still maintain? If it were not for the Shenlin Jun and the small number of soldiers of Fallen Star Army. With this army, Lin Yuan could stand proudly in the north and rule across the river from Lei Qiusheng, and not be attacked by the Shuangjin barbarian. After all, if the strength of both sides was equal, neither Lin Yuan nor Lei Qiusheng would blindly break the balance, because that would only be taken advantage of by others. Neither of them could laugh until the end. But now the military strength of Shenwu dynasty was far above the northern frontier, but the speed of growth was far slower than the northern frontier. That was why Lei Qiusheng was anxious to suppress the northern frontier, and was determined to strangle this giant in the cradle. That was why the Frost Mirror barbarian had entered the pass. But as the fighting became longer and longer, Gao Buzhan also got rid of the hot blood of returning to the battlefield, and looked at the problem with a calm attitude again. Soon, Gao Buzhan realized that something was wrong. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. The Divine Forest Army's reserves were losing members too fast. Gao Jia felt that even if these 35,000 people were replaced with the main force of the Fallen Star Army, they would not be able to cause such a huge loss of members. As the enemy's defensive line became smaller and smaller, their battle formation also became smaller and smaller. Sacrificing some soldiers in exchange for a chance to retreat. Gao Chuanjin frowned slightly, and his face suddenly turned cold. He raised the sword in his hand and said fiercely, "Everyone, follow me in charge." Seeing that Gao Buzhan had sped up the attack, the commander of Shenlin Jun's reserve force also understood that his abnormal speed of losing soldiers didn't escape the eyes of the enemy. But soon, a determined look flashed across his face, and he shouted, "This guy has found out our intention. It won't be so easy to escape. Quickly seal the tunnel and face the enemy." As the voice fell, nearly 40% of Shenlin Jun's reserve force in the field were defeated. The enemy only had 35,000 people, and with the loss of soldiers during the battle, it was estimated that there were less than 30,000 people left now. Even if they were all unstoppable, it was impossible for them to have such a big appetite to eat all of them. Therefore, in their initial estimation, they only needed to lose about 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers to protect most of the good seedlings and escape from here. Therefore, the outermost army formation was basically made up of old guys with inferior cultivation aptitude. They were all veterans who were willing to sacrifice themselves. But after this order was issued, the rest of the soldiers who had the chance to retreat were suddenly a little unhappy. Especially the few officers who were about to enter the tunnel, their faces were so gloomy that it was almost dripping water. The commander's face was also gloomy, and he said coldly, "If those people rush in without caring about their lives, how long can we hold on?" When we enter the tunnel, we will be caught. Not only will we have no way to survive, but we will also implicate our brothers who have already escaped. In the time it took to talk, the outermost line of defense had been completely torn apart. Under the incomparable charge of Gao Buzhan, these so-called elites were just small soldiers who could kill dozens of soldiers with one strike. Seal the tunnel and prepare the camp. Although the face of the officer at the entrance of the tunnel was not good for a long time, his face was a little more relieved. Since this was fate, what was there to hesitate about? Even if he sacrificed himself in exchange for his brothers to escape, there would be a day when someone would avenge him. Yes, even if the situation had deteriorated to this point, these soldiers who had been instilled with the idea of being loyal to Lei Chuxing still did not think that the Xinwu dynasty would lose this war. Right now, they were just letting that Black Jiao be arrogant for a few more days. Without much hesitation, they decisively pulled down a mechanism. The tunnel entrance that was originally big enough for 3 to 4 people to pass through collapsed in an instant. The original entrance was already covered by sand, and it would take at least half a day to dig out the entrance again. Damn it! The sound of the tunnel entrance being destroyed was not small, and Gao Buzhan could clearly feel the tremors under his feet. Almost instantly, Gao Buzhan guessed what those people had done and could not help but curse with a gloomy face. Outside the city, Lin Yuan also felt the change and guessed that the mechanism in the city had been destroyed. Although it was a pity, he could only shake his head lightly and sneered, "If you want to wedge a nail, then so be it. Why did you have to choose to do it near Wei River? Courting death." In fact, the Xinwu dynasty had never considered the hidden dangers in the north. After all, the aristocratic families in the north were generally weaker than the south, and there was also the Hengduan Mountains in the north. Therefore, the only force in the north that could threaten the Xinwu dynasty was the Frost Mirror Barbarian. Wei River City was a fortress built by Lei Chuxing. Not only was it used as a base for Shenlin Jun, but it could also be used as a refuge for the descendants of the Lei family. Lei Chuxing had never thought that the situation would deteriorate to the point that Shenlin Jun had to leave his base. He also did not expect that the Hengduan Mountains, where there were many birds and beasts, would give birth to an anomaly like Lin Yuan. He actually used his own strength to mobilize the Wei River for his own use. He also did not expect that Lin Yuan did not mobilize all of his military forces to fight against the Shuangjin barbarian when the Frost Mirror barbarian invaded. Instead, he maintained his conquest of the entire northern territory. All kinds of situations that Lei Chuxing had never thought of piled up together led to the fall of this so-called impregnable fortress. Chapter 495. However, the fall of the fortress was only the first step. Gao Chuanjin quickly rushed to the entrance of the tunnel. He frowned and thought for a moment. Then, he found some soldiers who were still energetic and began to dig the ground. After 2 hours, they finally cleared out all the sand, revealing a dark and endless tunnel. Gao Chuanjin's face showed a little joy. The joy on Gao Chuanjin's face didn't last long. He calmly sent a group of soldiers down to explore the tunnel. He also told them that no matter if they met Shenlin Jun's reserve soldiers, they should send someone back to report every half an hour. However, after several groups of people went down, not a single person came back to report. This made Gao Chuanjin's heart turn cold. Because he didn't even hear the sound of fighting. In addition, he sent 3,000 to 4,000 people. It was impossible for them to not even have a chance to retreat before being wiped out by Shenlin Jun's reserve soldiers. Then, the only possibility was that there was something wrong with this tunnel. After reorganizing his thoughts, Gao Chuanjin chased away the joy of victory from his mind. He did indeed remember some rumors about Lei Chuxing when he was building this fortress that was known as impregnable. At the beginning of the construction, the designer had built many secret tunnels filled with traps in Wei River City. Unless one had the original blueprints, one might die from the traps if they entered the tunnels. Even if one's cultivation was high enough that the traps couldn't do anything to them, it was easy to get lost in the labyrinthine tunnels. After that, in order to keep it a secret, even the designer was secretly executed by Lei Chuxing. Only Shenlin Jun's generals and temporary commanders knew the structure of the tunnels. These people were basically going to serve Shenlin Jun for life until they died of old age. Their purpose was to ensure the absolute safety of this tunnel. After thinking this through, Gao Chuanjun could only bitterly laugh twice and accept the fact that he didn't want to accept. There was no way to break this tunnel. Either he got the blueprint or he could only leave it alone. In this battle, nearly 100,000 Shenlin Jun's reserve troops were annihilated. However, after the rest of the troops escaped into the underground tunnel, even a general like Gao Buzhan who had been through hundreds of battles couldn't help but hesitate. He didn't even know how to face Lin Yuan. After all, they didn't know how long these tunnels were, how many changes there were, and where the exit at the other end of the tunnels was. Moreover, after losing 3,000 to 4,000 men, Gao Jiazhen didn't dare to take any more risks with his brothers. The only thing they could be sure of was that no matter how long this tunnel was, it couldn't go all the way to the Central Plains. After all, they didn't know how deep the Wei River was, and it was impossible for them to go around it. If they really dug such a deep tunnel, it wouldn't be able to provide enough support, and it could collapse at any time. At that time, not only would they not be able to protect the tunnel, even the fortress above ground would be destroyed together with it. Therefore, it was impossible for these Shenlin Jun's reserve troops to return to the Central Plains. They could only go to different places in the north through different secret tunnels, and then become a nail that was nailed into the palm of the northern frontier. Although Gao Jiazhen already knew that he couldn't do his best in this battle, the two sides were in a deadlock here. Compared to the Shenlin Jun's reserve troops escaping from under his nose, it was two different things. The former was just a lack of troops and siege equipment, but the latter was tantamount to pointing at his nose and calling him a piece of trash. Gao Jiazhen, who was helpless, could only secretly spit and curse. They claimed to be invincible, but in the end, they dug so many rat holes in the ground. They want to be a whore and set up a monument to their chastity. It doesn't matter. They're just a group of defeated soldiers. At most, they'll be disgusting, but they won't be a big problem. Lin Yuan, who walked in from outside the city, comforted Gao Jiazhen and said with a chuckle, "Old Gao, I'll leave the construction of the defense line along the river to you. You must come up with your first plan within 3 days. This is your chance to become famous in the northern frontier. Although Li Zhong and the others will definitely raise objections, if you can make it perfect and pass it with a unanimous vote, then the impact on your future will definitely be different from the subsequent plans that need to be modified and pieced together." Hearing Lin Yuan's words, Gao Jiazhen's face also turned red, which was rare. Although he was ostracized in the Xinwu dynasty for decades, this didn't mean that Gao Jiazhen didn't care about fame. If that was the case, then why did he join the Fallen Star Army in the first place? Why did he have to risk his life to become a champion? Yan Xingqi had been exiled in the northern frontier for decades. Although his old subordinates still respected him, his prestige was not as high as before. Otherwise, under Yan Xingqi's call, there would be more than just Gao Jiazhen and his 5,000 old brothers who came to the northern frontier to join Lin Yuan. What really attracted Gao Jiazhen was the talent selection system of the northern frontier. In the northern frontier, one's background, wealth, status, and even reputation didn't matter much. If one wanted to become a real person in the northern frontier, then one needed to have enough ability. As a former champion, Gao Jiazhen was confident that he could occupy a place in the northern frontier military. However, after the establishment of the Northern Frontier Academy, Gao Jiazhen saw many talents in the field of military studies. This made him worry about his future position. His only advantage now was that he had rich experience on the battlefield. Moreover, he didn't need to study those basic courses on the battlefield to be able to directly enter the battlefield. If he couldn't establish his own authority now, then when the northern frontier was filled with bright stars in the future, he wouldn't have much room to do. And now, the defense line along the river was bound to become the first battlefield against the main forces of the Shinwu dynasty. Whether or not the northern frontier could withstand the first round of the Shinwu dynasty's counterattack would depend on how far-sighted this defense line plan was. Whether or not it could make the generals of the Shinwu dynasty rack their brains to think of a way to defeat them. As long as they could withstand the first round of the Shinwu dynasty's counterattack, even if the defense line was destroyed in the following tug-of-war, Gao Jiajin could rely on this contribution to become one of the future generals of the northern frontier. Moreover, it would be an extremely dazzling one. It would definitely be more valuable than a champion in name only. Moreover, this defense line not only had to be impenetrable, but it also had to be exquisitely designed and inexpensive. Otherwise, with the financial resources of the northern frontier, if they wanted to carry out the Great Wall plan and the defense line along the river at the same time, there was no doubt that they would be unable to make ends meet. It was even possible that next year's financial resources would be overdrawn to the point of a deficit. Gao Jiajin dismounted from his horse and knelt in front of Lin Yuan on one knee. He clasped his fist and said, "This subordinate is not talented. I can only repay the Dragon King with my life." Chapter 496. Apart from the brief interlude in Wei River City, the entire northern battlefield had entered a white-hot zone. The Yao beasts and demi-human warriors hiding in the forest taught the Frost Mirror barbarians a good lesson. For the first time, the Frost Mirror barbarians personally experienced that war wasn't as simple as being completely annihilated by the other side or completely annihilated by the other side. Under the command of the graduates of the Northern Frontier Academy, the demi-human army methodically divided the Frost Mirror barbarian army into pieces of meat that made them drool. Then, taking advantage of the terrain where the enemy's warhorses weren't suitable for charging in the mountains and forests, as well as the overwhelming advantage of the Northern Frontier's armaments, the demi-human army slowly devoured the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers who dared to enter the mountains and forests. After losing nearly 200,000 soldiers, the Frost Mirror barbarian commanders also learned of the strategy of "don't enter the forest." They didn't give the northern frontier a chance to divide and tear them apart, and took the initiative to disperse their forces and occupy the plains. In this way, the northern frontier army's lack of training was highlighted, and the quality of the soldiers was uneven. After all, in a large battle, your fellow soldiers and comrades would give you a chance to fill in the gaps. But in a small-scale battle, everyone couldn't even take care of themselves. Who would have the time to clean up your mess? However, the setback on the northern frontier was within everyone's expectations, and they didn't fall into a disappointing situation. They changed their previous aggressive attitude and concentrated their forces in the mountains and forests, or stationed them in places that the army had to pass through. In any case, they didn't continue to engage in small-scale battles with the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers. This made the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers suffer, because their primary mission in the northern frontier wasn't to suppress the northern frontier, but to find the 13th prince. The 13th prince was the Frost Mirror Khan's favorite son, and he was even called Badu on the grassland, which meant the warrior of the grassland. In the Frost Mirror grassland where power determined status, having such a son ensured that Shuang Jihan would be able to protect his Shuiliao tribe from being swallowed up by other tribes even if he was pulled down from the throne of Great Khan by other tribes. After all, the 13th prince's Shuiliao cavalry was a tough nut to crack. Anyone who wanted to chew on them would have to grind their teeth off. Those tribes wanted to preserve their strength, so they naturally wouldn't engage in a bloody battle with the Shuiliao tribe. But now, they were trapped in the northern plains, unable to advance even half a step. Moreover, they did not know what was happening behind them. Even their supply line had been cut off by the northern frontier army. Until now, not a single grain of rice had been sent in. Seeing that their rations were about to run out, they had no choice but to kill extra warhorses to satisfy their hunger. But where would they find extra warhorses? The Shuangjin barbarian soldiers could only kill the exhausted warhorses and replace their mounts with the other two warhorses that had not ridden into the northern frontier. This was tantamount to drinking poison to quench thirst, because if they didn't change their mounts, the most fatal problem for the cavalry would be their stamina problem. Originally, they could still plunder the cities in the northern frontier, but Li Zhong's strategy of erecting walls and clearing the wilderness left only a few troops disguised as Shenwu dynasty soldiers in the northern frontier. There was only a small amount of rations left, and it wasn't even enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. These soldiers who stayed behind to guard the northern frontier were basically doing it voluntarily. Their bravery was unparalleled, so it wasn't easy to chew on a hard bone, and even if they did, they wouldn't be full. After a few losses, they gave up on those cities. They didn't even know what to do with the captives they caught. It would be a waste to kill them. After all, although the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were good at fighting in the wilderness, they were not good at sieging cities. They didn't know that the northern frontier had removed the city walls, so they naturally had to keep a certain number of cannon fodder and slaves to prepare for a war of attrition against the cities of the northern frontier. It was exactly the same strategy as the beast tied when attacking human cities. Therefore, it wasn't unreasonable for them to be called barbarians. Apart from looking like humans, they were almost no different from monsters in the eyes of the other 6 great empires. But if they kept these people alive, they would have more food to feed. If this went on, they might even eat humans with bloodshot eyes. Before these Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers entered the northern frontier, they naturally didn't know that the aristocratic families and sects in the northern frontier had already been wiped out by Li Zhongxing. Under the operation of the embroidered uniform guards, all the wealth accumulated by those aristocratic families had been swallowed up by Lin Yuan. As long as the people in the cities were evacuated, the entire northern frontier would instantly become a battlefield. Without the obstruction of the aristocratic families and sects, this step was particularly easy. After all, no one wanted to live on the battlefield. There was no guarantee that they would lose their lives at any time. The supplies were transported by the supply caravans, and the routes of the supply caravans were basically in the mountains or places where there were large numbers of soldiers. With just these Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers, it was impossible for them to steal anything without paying a heavy price. Moreover, several times before they succeeded, the soldiers of the northern frontier actually set fire to the caravans and even fought directly on the burning caravans. In the end, the soldiers and the caravans were burned to ashes together. They didn't give them any supplies at all. In particular, these supply caravans were all from the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. These guys who had been traveling in the Hingduan Mountains all year round were not to be trifled with. They had to be on guard at all times against demonic beasts or other forces in the northern frontier. Their fighting ability in the mountains and plains was not much worse than the demi-human army and demonic beasts. They were the toughest of the toughest. After all, the 13th prince had been lost in the northern frontier. Now, even the main forces of the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were having such a hard time, let alone the 13th prince, who they had lost contact with for a long time. At this moment, most of the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers believed that the 13th prince, who had lost contact with the Frost Mirror grassland, had most likely died at the hands of the people of the northern frontier. Even the Bloodridge Knights who were originally from the Bloodridge tribe didn't believe that the 13th prince was still alive. After this period of fighting, the people of the northern frontier were fiercer and more barbaric than the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers. Many of the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were even thinking of retreating. They felt that it was useless to continue staying in the northern frontier. It was better for them to go back and recuperate. Although the Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers were allocated with 3 horses per person, they couldn't eat all of them. Although the people of the grassland knew how to fight, if they wanted to cross the Frost Mirror grassland on foot without horses, it was no different from suicide. The Shuangjin barbarian soldiers were gloomy. They even began to secretly complain about their ally, the Shenwu dynasty. After all, they had agreed to it on the surface. Until now, the Shenwu dynasty had not sent a single soldier to put pressure on the northern frontier. Otherwise, the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers would never have fallen to such a miserable state. Chapter 497. The war gradually reached its climax, but the Xinwu dynasty still didn't make a move. It wasn't that they didn't want to take this opportunity to attack the northern frontier, but the Frost Mirror barbarian troops entering the Central Plains were like fish entering water. Fighting cavalry in the endless plains was undoubtedly foolish. Thus, the Xinwu dynasty's army could only choose to retreat and defend the cities, leaving large areas of wilderness and villages to the Frost Mirror barbarian troops. However, even though most of the cities in the Central Plains were much more prosperous than the small cities in the north, their defensive capabilities couldn't be compared. They couldn't withstand the attacks of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Frost Mirror barbarian troops. Almost every now and then, news of a city falling would reach the imperial capital. A group of aristocratic family heads, sect disciples, and nobles were all cowering in the temporarily safe imperial capital, trembling in fear. Although the Xinwu dynasty's imperial capital seemed to be absolutely safe for the time being, even the monarch, Lei Chouxing, was aware of the problem. As the instigators, how could they not know how much the imperial army in charge of protecting the imperial capital had been corrupted by them? It would be safer for them to go up and fight against the ferocious Shuangjin barbarian troops rather than rely on those young masters to climb up the city walls and fight against the ferocious Shuangjin barbarian troops. In an instant, the entire imperial capital was covered in a gloomy cloud of gloom. According to the style of these aristocratic families, they didn't care about anything other than their own land. If not for the fact that Lei Chouxing was a powerful and tyrannical monarch, some people would have already begun to force Lei Chouxing to give up large amounts of territory and recall the border troops to resist the Shuangjin barbarian troops. As for the consequences of doing so, they didn't care and didn't want to care. In any case, dying a few years later was better than dying now. I wonder what the situation is like in the north. A commander of the Blood Liao cavalry carefully wiped his blood-stained scimitar clean on an animal's skin before slowly sheathing it. Behind him were countless ferocious Blood Liao knights, as well as an even larger number of disheveled, and demoralized slave soldiers. In front of them was a burning city. Judging from the tall and wide walls, this city definitely had a high status in the Central Plains. However, not only did this rich city fail to stop the Frost Mirror barbarians' advance, it only served to increase their desire to plunder. After all, even though the Xinwu dynasty might not be as rich as the entire Shuangjin dynasty, a city in the Xinwu dynasty was definitely richer than a tribe in the Frost Mirror Prairie. Even the Frost Mirror Khan's Blood Liao tribe was no exception. These Frost Mirror barbarian who had entered the Central Plains were living a much better life than their compatriots in the north. They ate until their mouths were full of oil, and they continued to collect large amounts of wealth. Once the higher-ups gave the order to retreat, they could leave at any time. With the wealth they plundered, they could at least raise the strength of the entire tribe by 2 levels. In addition, the public opinion that Lin Yuan had carefully created also exploded at this moment. Almost all the people believed that the border army had already been defeated. Otherwise, it would be impossible for so many barbarians from the northern frontier to enter the Central Plains. Many people didn't even wait for the Frost Mirror barbarian to continue moving south. They had already spontaneously started migrating further south. This move was absolutely fatal to the current Xinwu dynasty. The north was already out of control, and the south was in endless chaos. If even the people in the Central Plains fled, it would mean that the Xinwu dynasty wouldn't receive a single grain tax in the coming year. Apart from shamelessly asking for peace with Lin Yuan and acknowledging his control over the north, they could only earn resources through the sea trade route in the south. Otherwise, they would all have nothing to eat next year. Lei Chouxing had no choice but to order officials at all levels to appease the people. At the same time, the border army in the north was on full alert to resist the Shuangjin barbarian reinforcements with all their might. The situation in the Central Plains was indeed stabilized in a short period of time. At the very least, the number of Frost Mirror barbarian troops no longer increased. After the supply line was cut off, they were no longer as difficult to deal with as before. With the garrisons in each city, they could still hold on for a while. At the very least, the situation in the Central Plains would not happen again. But at the same time, they had also blocked the Frost Mirror barbarians' path to invade the northern frontier. This immediately reduced the pressure on the northern frontier. And the Frost Mirror barbarian invaders were right to complain about their allies, because it was the Shinwu dynasty that had cut off their supply line. There was no other way. After all, the place where the barbarians invaded was the source of the Wei River. If the defense line in the north remained open, these barbarians could cross the Wei River and enter the Central Plains at any time. Therefore, if they wanted to stop the Frost Mirror barbarians' attack, they couldn't leave any openings. This time, it could be said that Lei Chuxing had shot himself in the foot. Not only did he not cause the northern region to be unable to recover from this setback, but he had also suffered enough. Every day, he had a sickly look on his face and did not even attend court if he could. After all, once the officials gathered, there would always be an imperial censor who would come out to question him. Why were the 700,000 Frost Mirror barbarian able to bypass the border army's defenses and plunder the Central Plains? Why did the Shinwu dynasty suffer such heavy losses? Why didn't they send out a decent army to win 2 battles to vent their anger? Of course, Lei Chuxing wouldn't say that this was a plan he had prepared to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. First, he could let the Frost Mirror barbarian invade the north and delay Lin Yuan's annexation of the north. This would give him enough time to pacify the south or mobilize his troops to fight the northern frontier. In addition, Lei Chuxing had previously used his connections to transfer a group of Blood Liao knights into the northern frontier. It was as if a knife was hanging over his head. He wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to reorganize the northern defense line and get rid of all the generals who were close to Lei Chuxing in one fell swoop before replacing them with trusted subordinates. But he didn't expect the Shuangjin barbarian to do this repeatedly. Not only did he want to attack the north, he didn't even let off his ally. After all, Lei Chuxing couldn't announce that all this was because of his own mistakes, could he? In that case, how could he still be the emperor? Moreover, as a political expert, Lei Chuxing could naturally see the real side of the matter from the layers of appearances. For example, the seemingly sharp questions of the imperial censor were actually just a prelude. Once the time was right, those aristocratic families would force him to cede a large amount of land to the Shuangjin dynasty and the Qingjiang dynasty in exchange for peace. Anyway, the one who would lose was the Shinwu dynasty, not the aristocratic families. Now that the Shinwu dynasty was in danger, if they continued to support Lei Chuxing to fight on 2 fronts, and at the same time become enemies with the northern frontier, the inheritance of the aristocratic families that had been passed down for hundreds or even thousands of years would be destroyed in their hands. Of course, after this main goal was achieved, they would propose to withdraw the troops in various regions. It seemed that they wanted to reduce the expenditure of the national treasury, but in fact, they wanted Lei Chuxing to disperse his cultivation and gradually lose the ability to suppress the aristocratic family's troops. Chapter 498. This was the main reason why Lei Chuxing detested the aristocratic families. Lin Yuan was thinking of ways to eliminate different voices at the northern frontier. However, within the Shinwu dynasty, various factions were thinking of ways to weaken Lei Chuxing's power. They didn't seek to pull Lei Chuxing down from the throne, but at least they wanted to prevent Lei Chuxing from killing them as he wished. Of course, people were greedy and insatiable. Once they weakened Lei Chuxing's power step by step, the next thing they would do would be to covet the sacred artifacts and experience the feeling of taking turns to be the emperor. Lei Chuxing was even a little envious of Lin Yuan. Although the northern frontier wasn't big, after a series of purges and suppression, the entire northern frontier was under Lin Yuan's control. If he wanted to fight a war, it would be fought. If he wanted to fight a war, it would be fought for as long as he wanted. No one dared to say anything. This was because the aristocratic families in the northern frontier were relying on Lin Yuan to survive. Once Lin Yuan fell from power, the entire northern frontier would be weakened and destroyed. This kind of method of attaching an entire force to a single person was extremely stupid. Once there was no outstanding successor, then the speed of the force's growth would be the same as the speed of its collapse. Lei Chouxing knew that this method was stupid, but he still dreamed of becoming such an emperor. However, he was helpless. Back then, he was able to ascend to the throne by relying on his military power. However, with the abilities of those big shots, it was impossible for them to govern the region. Therefore, he could only use a large number of talents from the aristocratic families and sections. This resulted in the current situation where he couldn't get rid of his subordinates. Zhang Xiao, Lei Chouxing, who was pacing back and forth in Yangxin Palace Hall, subconsciously called out. However, a trace of sadness quickly appeared on Lei Chouxing's face. That person was no longer here. Actually, putting aside the fact that he was a surviving member of the Zhao clan, Zhang Xiao had done his best under Lei Chouxing. He had managed the embroidered guard from nothing to a ferocious tiger that everyone feared. Although it couldn't be separated from Lei Chouxing's great support behind him, it was enough to show that Zhang Xiao wasn't an embroidered pillow like Lin Yuan had described him to be. On the contrary, Zhang Xiao was a great talent with real talent. Moreover, after decades of getting along with each other, the stubborn Lei Chouxing had also treated Zhang Xiao as one of his few friends. Although they were not as close as Shadow, who had grown up together, they were still closer than Lei Chouxing. Now that there was a problem with the war strategy, Lei Chouxing sadly discovered that he couldn't even find someone to discuss it with. After a while, Lei Chouxing walked out of Yangxin Palace Hall with bloodshot eyes and strode to the Yamen of the Servants' Administration. Greetings, Your Majesty. The Servants' Administration wasn't just one of the two intelligence agencies in Lei Chouxing's hands. It was also a place that trained eunuchs and palace maids to serve the imperial family, nobles, and even high-ranking officials. For people born in this place, they had to remember the faces of even the students who had passed the imperial examinations but hadn't had the chance to be promoted. How could they be blind when facing Lei Chouxing, the ruler of a country? Lei Chouxing waved his hand, indicating for the eunuchs and palace maids to stand up. At the same time, he asked, "Where is my Shenlin Jun now? How long will it take for him to return?" However, the response to Lei Chouxing was a deathly silence. Suddenly, Lei Chouxing's heart skipped a beat. There was even a hint of panic on his face. As his trump card, Shenlin Jun's importance to him was self-evident. If something happened to Shenlin Jun, not to mention the covetous eyes of the two empires, even Lin Yuan could step on his head and abuse his power. "Speak!" Lei Chouxing fiercely stomped his foot, shattering a white jade tile as he roared in annoyance. An old eunuch with snow-white hair trembled as he knelt on the ground. He said bitterly, "Your Majesty, after Shenlin Jun received Your Majesty's decree, he was stopped by eunuch Tai before he could leave. I'm afraid he won't be able to return in a short period of time." Hearing that his shadow had left Shenlin Jun in the south at such a time of crisis, Lei Chouxing's face didn't reveal any strange expression. However, his heart grew heavier and heavier. This was because the shadow's action meant that there was an even bigger mess in the south. It was no longer a problem that could be solved by killing Lei Chouxing or wiping out a few aristocratic families. The old eunuch quietly raised his head. When he saw that Lei Chouxing hadn't delivered the goods, he lowered his head again and said, "According to the news that eunuch Tai sent a while ago, those evil cultists who were banished overseas have now returned to the south to preach. Currently, a large number of people have already joined them." Eunuch Tai said that there are countless rebel armies in the south. There is no army that can be trusted. Only Shenlin Jun, who is loyal to Your Majesty to the death, can take on this great responsibility and eliminate those evil cultists. Evil. Teach. Disciple. The moment these three words appeared, Lei Chouxing only felt that his brain had exploded with a buzzing sound. His vision instantly turned white. As the actual ruler of the Shenwu dynasty, he knew too many secrets that others didn't know. He was very clear that the top forces who called themselves the guardians of the heavenly gates were mortal enemies with these evil cultists. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that both sides had an irreconcilable hatred. They definitely wouldn't sit by and watch the evil cultists develop and grow stronger in the south. They wouldn't even let them enter the south. But now, not only had the evil cultists entered the south, they had even started to preach in the south. No one had come out to control them. Even the shadow had no choice but to disobey Lei Qiuxing's orders and intercept Shenlin Jun. He was prepared to let them take on the responsibility of eliminating the evil cultists at any time. However, the attitude of the guardians of the heavenly gates had already explained many things. Since they could tolerate the evil cultists preaching in the south, it meant that they were willing to make almost any concessions other than directly sending troops to suppress the Shenwu dynasty. Ha, 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 Lei Qiuxing opened his mouth and laughed bitterly. The sound coming from his throat was like a broken bellows. Your Majesty, the old eunuch raised his head with a worried expression. He looked at Lei Qiuxing, who had changed his usual shrewd style. He felt as if he was being chased, and his heart was tightly clenched. After all, these eunuchs grew up and learned in the palace. Their loyalty to Lei Qiuxing was definitely no less than that of Shenlin Jun. It might even surpass that of Shenlin Jun. After all, Shenlin Jun was a professional soldier. He could still live well without Lei Qiuxing. Even if he retired and went to a remote city to be a demon slayer or a mercenary, he could still live a good life. However, these eunuchs were different. Without Lei Qiuxing, they were just a group of lonely disabled people with no one to rely on. Even if their cultivation was high and their wealth was comparable to that of a country, they would still end up with no one to send them off in their old age. Their power, their lives, and even their everything were linked to Lei Qiuxing. Naturally, they had to think about Lei Qiuxing at all times. Chapter 499. This humble one is doing very well. Lei Qiuxing finally regained some clarity after hearing the old eunuch's call. However, he felt an inexplicable sadness in his heart. No matter how he viewed himself, the current rotten situation had become a mess that was difficult for him to clean up. This was especially true after Lin Yuan revealed his ambitions. Lei Qiuxing was in a state of panic and had taken many remedial measures. However, the more he did, the more mistakes he made, which led to the current situation. Even though Lei Qiuxing knew that as long as he had enough time to deal with the south, even if Lin Yuan completely took over the north, he would still have the strength to fight. However, the enormous pressure that had been accumulating in his heart day after day made Lei Qiuxing, blinded by greed, choose to open the border. He gritted his teeth and let the frost mirror barbarian into the country, but he didn't expect that he would shoot himself in the foot. His originally resentful attitude completely changed after hearing the news of the southern evil cultists. He originally only treated Lin Yuan as an equal opponent, but he didn't expect that Lin Yuan's plans were even greater than his. The cultists had even bypassed him and directly contacted the most powerful forces. If the shadow had not happened to be in the south, it was likely that the cultists would have caused a huge ruckus before the report would appear on the shadow's desk. Because at this moment, Lei Qiuxing clearly understood that it wasn't just Lin Yuan. Even the civil and military officials of the court, as well as the top-level factions, all thought of him as the loser before the war even began. None of you are optimistic about this humble one's chances. This humble one is going to win this war no matter what. Lei Qiuxing suddenly took a deep breath and said in a low voice, Eunuch Zhua, this humble one doesn't have any trustworthy people by his side right now. I can only trouble the servants' administration to make a trip to the northern border. Have the troops there withdraw in batches to the central plains and defend the imperial capital to the death. Without this humble one's orders, no one is allowed to fight on their own. Those who disobey will have their entire family executed. The old eunuch called Eunuch Zhua was shaken. He looked at Lei Qiuxing in disbelief, as if this was the first time he had met this person. I am very clear-headed now. I know the consequences of doing so. Lei Chou-shing gritted his teeth and fiercely said, "Didn't they look down on me? They want this humble one's beautiful country, but this humble one will not give it to them. Even if they are lucky enough to beat this humble one this time, this humble one will leave them with a terrible mess." Yes. Eunuch Zhuo lowered his head again and pressed his forehead against the ground, trying to control his emotions. He wasn't sure what Lei Chou-shing was feeling right now, but he was sure that Lei Chou-shing wasn't clear-headed at the moment. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made such a decision that harmed others without benefiting himself. He wouldn't have chosen to give up on all his plans at this time. However, Eunuch Zhuo did not have Eunuch Tai's cultivation, nor did he have Zhang Xiu's forbearance, nor did he have Li Zhong's wisdom. He was just a loyal official, a foolish loyal official. Thus, even though he knew that Lei Chou-shing's decision was wrong, Eunuch Zhuo did not speak up to dissuade him. On the frost mirror grassland far away from the Shenwu dynasty, in the royal tent of the Shuiliao tribe, a man who seemed to be in his 30s was holding a book in his left hand and a white stone in his right. His brows were furrowed as he sat in the tent in deep thought. But he was the only person in the tent. No one knew who he was playing Go with, or what he was thinking about. The man's skin was white and delicate, as smooth as milk. He didn't seem like a child of the grassland who had been tempered by the sun and wind day and night. Instead, he seemed like one of those scholarly Confucian disciples from the south of the Shenwu dynasty. He even wore a moon-white brocade robe, the style of which had been popular in the Shenwu dynasty last year. However, the material used was even more luxurious and expensive than the vast majority of high-class cloth shops. One could tell at a glance that it was no ordinary item. Even more inconceivable was that the book in the man's hand was not some incomprehensible Go manual, nor was it a Confucian classic. Instead, it was a book that could be seen everywhere on the northern frontier and that no one dared to disobey, the new laws of the northern frontier. Third Prince, the Blood Eagle has sent back a message. A frost mirror barbarian wearing a leather coat and iron armor placed a stack of parchment in front of the man. Without waiting for him to speak, the frost mirror barbarian cupped his fists and left the tent. The man acted as if he hadn't heard anything. His brows were still furrowed as he pondered for an incense stick's worth of time. Suddenly, his eyes lit up and he gently placed the white stone in his hand on the chessboard. The entire chessboard instantly came to life. The white stone that had been in a disadvantageous position suddenly twisted and turned into a killing move. At this point, the man finally put down the book in his hand. He stood up and walked to a copper basin to wash his hands with water. Then, he used a piece of dry animal skin to wipe the water off his hands. Only then did he return to his soft couch and sit down. He picked up the stack of parchment and began to read. It wasn't until he finished reading the last parchment that the man slowly exhaled and murmured, "He's gone mad." The Blood Eagle was an intelligence agency that he had set up himself. However, Frost Mirror Barbarian wasn't good at intelligence. Even if he disguised himself, his skin and demeanor were completely different from those who lived in a world where birds sang and flowers bloomed. Therefore, there were very few secret agents and spies in the Shuangjin dynasty. Even if there were a few similar organizations, they were short-lived. They were either destroyed in an instant or slowly fell into a useless state. Even though his Blood Eagle could hide in the Shenwu dynasty, it still couldn't obtain first-hand information. This was also the reason why he could slowly think of a way to solve the chessboard after receiving the information about the Shenwu dynasty. However, based on this outdated information, he could draw several conclusions. Firstly, his valiant 13th brother was already confirmed dead. Second, the strength of the northern frontier was far beyond their imagination. It was estimated that none of the people who entered the north this time could come out. Third, Lei Chou-shing had gone mad. The first two pieces of information were already speculated by him. Even if they were confirmed now, they weren't worth mentioning. However, the last piece of information made him cautious. In addition to the information he received this morning, Lei Chuxing was going to withdraw the border army in the north and let them directly enter the rich and livable hinterland of the Shenwu dynasty to occupy territory and plunder treasures. In other words, Lei Chuxing was going to use the entire Shuangjin dynasty as a knife and let them be the executioners whose hands were stained with blood. For Lei Chuxing would get rid of all the major problems and directly reshuffle the power structure of the entire Shenwu dynasty. But what if he's not mad? The third prince's eyebrows, which had just relaxed, were tightly knitted together again. His expression was a little uncertain. He dared to use the Shuangjin dynasty as a knife. Wasn't he afraid that it was easier to invite the devil than to send the devil away? Chapter 500. The third prince sat in his own tent and frowned as he pondered. After a while, he realized that something was not right. How did Lei Chuxing end up like this? It was because the Qingjiang Empire and Shuangjin Empire had joined forces with the Hingduan Mountains and the Dragon Palace of the Four Seas to attack the Shenwu dynasty at the same time. As a result, even the basic garrison troops were transferred to the front line. Although the front line looked stable, the interior was as soft as mud. Not to mention the northern frontier king and the Qingping king, even the rebels could threaten Lei Chuxing's position. However, why would the four forces join forces to attack the Shenwu dynasty? With the third prince's wisdom that did not match that of the people in the grassland, he quickly thought of the top forces that were above the empire. It was obvious that Lei Chuxing had offended one of the top forces because of something. That was why there was a war everywhere, giving the aristocratic families and sects who coveted the high position space to cause trouble. After joining forces with Lei Chuxing, the situation gradually became clear. The thing that made the top forces hate the Shenwu dynasty so much that they used all their influence to make the four forces join forces should still be in Lei Chuxing's hands. Otherwise, both the Shuangjin Empire and the Qingjiang Empire would have withdrawn their troops and returned to the empire. After all, the monster horde in the Hingduan Mountains would not reason with them. Since they had no military strength, the neighboring empires would not miss this opportunity to loot a burning house. However, the strange thing was that the forces that bordered the Qingjiang Empire and the Shuangjin Empire did not attack them at all. It was only after they attacked the northern frontier that the monster horde broke out on the Shuangjin grassland again. All the signs pointed to the fact that the item was still in Lei Chuxing's hands. Also, the reason why he dared to take the risk was that the item could help him turn the tables after his plan of driving the wolves to devour the tigers. He could destroy the Frost Mirror cavalry that invaded the Shenwu dynasty. Thinking of this, the third prince's forehead was instantly covered in a fine layer of cold sweat. Shakily standing up from his soft couch, the third prince walked step by step towards the door of the tent. This was not because his body was weak. On the contrary, the fact that he was able to maintain his fair and smooth skin on the Frost Mirror grassland was not because he was talented. Rather, it was because the third prince had cultivated at a terrifying speed since he was a child. He was only in his 30s, but he had already reached the Heaven Star realm. With his stellar energy protecting his body, he was naturally impervious to the cold wind. In terms of cultivation alone, the third prince was probably the strongest of the Frost Mirror Khagan's many sons. Unfortunately, leading an army into battle did not depend on the cultivation of the general. There were many other factors that had to be considered. Although the third prince was not inferior to the 13th prince in terms of strategy and adaptability, the third prince was not inferior to the 13th prince in terms of motivation, morale, and courage. Therefore, the 13th prince was Batalu, and the third prince was just the third prince. Your Highness, why are you? The two Bloodspan knights in charge of guarding the tent paled when they saw the third prince walk out of the tent. On the Frost Mirror grassland, where the 13th prince's fate was unknown, the third prince could not become the first successor of the Bloodspan tribe. However, the cunning third prince controlled the Blood Eagles. With the cunning of a fox and the eyes of an eagle, the third prince was practically the brain of the entire Bloodspan tribe. He spent most of his time in his tent, processing the intelligence reports from the Blood Eagles and formulating a plan of action for the Bloodspan tribe. Unless something major was about to happen, the third prince rarely left his tent. After all, the intelligence reports were already outdated. If he did not check them in time and did not react in time, the entire tribe might be plunged into an unknown and desperate situation that concerned the survival of the tribe. The third prince looked at the guards with a pale face and said in a low voice, "This matter is of great importance. It is not convenient for me to meet with my father directly. I can only trouble you to go first and tell my father that no matter what he is doing, he is to postpone everything and wait for me. Just say that our Reflection Frost dynasty is in grave danger. If we don't handle this matter properly, not only the Bloodbath tribe, but all the other tribes on the Reflection Frost plains will be wiped out." What a guy. When the guards heard this, their faces instantly paled. The third prince never spoke without thinking. Now that he said this, it meant that a great disaster was about to happen on the Frost Mirror grassland. The guards did not know that the exhausted Shinwu dynasty would not be able to stop the Shuangjin dynasty from taking the imperial capital now that the army had moved out in full force. However, the third prince was never one to speak empty words. Many people even respected the third prince with titles such as prophet or sage. This was because the things that the third prince had predicted over the past 10 years were all reflected in the time and place that he had predicted. Yes, I will go and see the great Khan now. After all, the third prince's guards were the brains of the Bloodspan tribe. Although they only had the title of a guard, their status was not inferior to the generals other than the princes. As long as they reported to the Great Khan, they would be able to see him. Also, the third prince turned to look in the direction of the Shinwu dynasty and said with a dark face, "We have to be prepared for both sides. My father has always favored the 13th prince, but it seems that he has died on the northern frontier. I am worried that my father will send troops out in anger and destroy all the tribes on the Frost Mirror grassland. Find a group of trustworthy people and inform the chiefs of the other tribes to come here for a meeting. Even if we have to force him, we cannot let my father continue this war." The guard trembled and his face paled, but his eyes flashed with determination. He said in a low voice, "Yes." Everyone knew that Shuangjin Khan favored the 13th prince. However, they were both Shuangjin Khan's sons. How could the third prince, who was the most talented and the wisest, not be interested in Shuangjin Khan's throne? If he succeeded in forcing the third prince to abdicate this time, he would have succeeded the third prince. As long as he could win this war, he would be a big shot in the Bloodspan tribe and even in the Shuangjin dynasty. When the time came, the third prince might even allow him to leave with his tribesmen and establish his own tribe. For a better life in the future, for a lord who could rule over a region. It was a gamble. The third prince, who did not know the guard's complicated thoughts, sighed as he watched the guard leave. He looked in the direction of the Shinwu dynasty and murmured, "I hope it is not too late." Chapter 501. If the Shuangjin dynasty could get their hands on information, the northern frontier would naturally be able to get their hands on it. In fact, they would be able to get their hands on it much faster. Looking at the report on the table that had been confirmed by the Association of the Demon Emperor and the embroidered uniform guard, Li Zhong's eyes were filled with doubt. Was Lei Qiuxing crazy, or was he making a huge gamble? Or was he trying to drag the northern frontier down with him? Li Zhong believed that a person at Lei Qiuxing's level wouldn't lose their will to fight just because of a momentary loss. He also didn't believe that Lei Qiuxing would make such a crazy decision. If that was the case, then he would have to wonder if the person who had invaded the country with a strong army was the current divine martial emperor Lei Qiuxing. Once the northern frontier army retreats back to the central plains, the Frost Mirror cavalry will be able to attack the Shinwu dynasty unscrupulously. Of course, they might also attack our northern frontier. Judging from the factors of this simultaneous invasion, the Shuangjin dynasty's tribes, big and small, should be more inclined to plunder the Shinwu dynasty, which is currently lacking in battle strength. However, the disappearance of the 13th prince will cause the Frost Mirror Khan to target the northern frontier. Lei Chuxing's seemingly crazy move has hit the nail on the head. If we go to stop the Shuangjin dynasty, we will have to split off our already small forces to take over the defense line left behind by the Shenwu dynasty's frontier army. Not only will it be a waste of effort, but it will also be easy for Lei Chuxing to attack us. However, if we don't stop the Shuangjin dynasty, we will have to face the most elite Shui Liao cavalry. Without the Shui Liao knights who could contend against the divine marshal Chongbu, with the strength of the Shenwu dynasty's border army and Lei Chuxing's plans, it would be more than enough to defeat the Shuangjin dynasty's invasion. When the time came, Lei Chuxing would be able to reverse his decline and rebuild the morale of the army. Then, he would be able to find an opportunity to fight us head-on. Right now, the northern frontier's strength is barely enough to deal with Lei Chuxing, who has recovered 50% of his strength. Add to that the Blood Liao Knights attack, and we can't mobilize more than 30% of our troops. Unless Uncle Gao's defensive fortifications along the river are miraculous, Lei Chuxing will be able to catch his breath and kill us with a single punch. Li Xiong muttered to himself. His eyes gradually regained their clarity. He said coldly, "What a Lei Chuxing." Everyone's wisdom was different, and the level at which they looked at problems was also different. Eunuch Zhuo was on the first level, and he could only see the harm of Lei Chuxing's move. The third prince was on the second level, and he could see the harm of Lei Chuxing's move. He could also see the benefits from it and derive a series of calculations. Li Zhong was on the third level, and he directly eliminated the areas that were harmful to the Shenwu dynasty. He found the most crucial point and even used it to deduce the unfavorable situation the northern frontier would soon face. As for which level Lei Chuxing was on, perhaps only he himself knew. When an expert made a move, the truth would be revealed. Lei Chuxing had chosen between the north and the south to survive. On one hand, he catered to the north to force the south, but on the other hand, he was worried that the north would become too powerful and difficult to control in the future. Under this kind of worrying situation, no matter how good a card he played, it would be a lousy one. It would be very easy for Li Zhong, Lin Yuan, and other people with great wisdom to find the flaws, and then break his killing moves one by one and counterattack. Even at this point, not only had Lei Chuxing not solved the trouble in the south, he had not even mobilized Lei Chuxing and the rebel army in the south. If not for Lin Yuan's tit-for-tat by letting the cultists land in the south, perhaps the south would still be stable and waiting for Lei Chuxing to be forced into a corner by the northern frontier. At that time, no matter what conditions the aristocratic families in the south offered, Lei Chuxing would have to pinch his nose and accept them, and the scales of victory would begin to tilt towards the interest groups in the south. At that point, whether it was Lei Chuxing or Lin Yuan, they would both become losers. It was just a matter of who would lose more in the end. But at the moment when he was completely on the verge of defeat, Lei Chuxing was able to sweep away all his worries and boldly adopt the method of no construction without destruction to meet the attack of the northern frontier. Moreover, he changed his previous scheming attitude and chose to use an open and above-board scheme. He made the Shuangjin dynasty his butcher's knife. While suppressing the northern frontier and sweeping away the aristocratic families in the central plains, he concentrated his forces to defend the imperial city and the nearby territories. With the Shuangjin barbarians' fighting style of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, he was bound to bypass the imperial city, which was a fat piece of meat, and directly sweep through the territory of the interest groups in the south. The cultists, the Frost Mirror Barbarian, and the interest groups in the south would first fight each other, and then Lei Chuxing would suddenly close the door and beat the dogs, directly eliminating all the internal problems. Even the aristocratic families that gave him a headache were swept away by the Shuangjin Barbarian. How many of them would be left unharmed? How many of them would dare to challenge Lei Chuxing? How could he count on the aristocratic families near the imperial city that Lei Chuxing was toying with? Moreover, the Shuangjin barbarian would not continue to attack the Shenwu dynasty. Instead, they would retreat to the Frost Mirror grasslands to lick their wounds. At that time, if the northern frontier still could not deal with the problem of the Blood Liao Knights, it would be a huge joke. Should he take this move or not? For the first time, Li Zhong felt that the wisdom he was so proud of was actually useless at this moment. He realized that compared to ambitious and ruthless characters like Lei Qiuxing and Lin Yuan, he lacked the most crucial thing: courage. He did not want to waste his energy fighting the Shuangjin dynasty, but he also did not want to take the risk of Lei Qiuxing rebuilding his confidence. At this moment, he did not know what to do. "Your Highness, battle report." A guard strode into Li Zhong's office and placed a battle report on Li Zhong's desk. Li Zhong tore open the wax seal on the envelope and took out the letter. His face immediately turned ashen as if he had eaten a fly. While he was still making preparations, Lei Qiuxing had already begun to move. At present, most of the northern border army had been wiped out, and the rest were fighting as they retreated toward the central plains. After all, these border armies had been stationed at the border for many years and had encountered the barbarians of the Shuangjin dynasty more than once or twice in the wilderness. While they might not be evenly matched, they would not be routed so quickly. This is troublesome. This is really troublesome. Li Zhong felt his temples throbbing with pain. Lei Qiuxing had actually played a dirty trick right in front of them. According to Li Zhong's usual logic, Lei Qiuxing's orders would be delivered to the border by trusted officials, and then the border army commanders would have to verify the authenticity of the orders before destroying the fortifications and slowly retreating to the vicinity of the imperial capital. But just as he received news that Lei Qiuxing was cutting off all means of retreat, the border army had already moved. What did this mean? It meant that Lei Qiuxing had given the Northern Frontier Intelligence Agency a vicious slap to the face. Chapter 502. Lei Qiuxing's order had already bypassed the intelligence system of the Northern Frontier and reached the border army. He pretended to be in the servants' administration just to confuse the intelligence agency of the Northern Frontier. He wanted Li Zhong and the others to think about it for a while when they received the message. Then he would take advantage of the time to mobilize the border army. In this way, no matter how fast the Northern Frontier's response was, it would be a joke. Because the border army had started to retreat in an orderly manner. Could the Northern Frontier attack the border army under the pressure of the Shuangjin barbarian and cut off their retreat? If the Northern Frontier really had that kind of strength, how could they be forced to this step? At the same time, it was also a challenge. How many troops do we have left? Li Zhong looked up at the guard who didn't have time to retreat, looking very gloomy. The guard thought for a while and said bitterly, "The main force of the southern expedition is in the border army to carry out the plan of the Great Wall. Some of them are in the north to clean up the rebels or to entangle the Frost Mirror barbarian who got separated from the main force. The Falling Star Army is now surveying the terrain near Wei River City, preparing to build a position to resist the naval attack of the Shenwu dynasty. The Subhuman Army is fighting with the demon beasts, so some of them are scattered in the forests. It's hard to gather them in a short time. If Your Highness wants to mobilize the troops as soon as possible, only the Northern Army hasn't been mobilized yet." Li Zhong was now a criminal. Without Lin Yuan's permission, the 100,000 guards of the prince's mansion were not allowed to leave Shunning City. They had already made a mistake once. If they made another mistake, no matter how good Li Zhong's reputation was, no one would be able to keep his head. Luckily, the Northern Army in the Northern Frontier could be mobilized though the guards couldn't be mobilized. Li Zhong thought for a while and scolded with a smile, "Mobilize the Northern Army? Then it's better not to do anything." The Northern Battlefront Army, which had just been expanded twice, was disbanded recently. Those experienced soldiers were all sent to the front line. Even the soldiers we lost in the rebellion of the 3 cities were sent from the Northern Battlefront Army. Do you think they still have people? Well, the guard touched his head and smiled. Even so, they are one of the 3 armies in the Northern Frontier. They can spare 100,000 soldiers, can't they? Your Highness, you think too much. He could tell that this prince didn't care about his own life at all. He knew that this was a job that would cost him his head, but he still wanted to take the 100,000 guards out and wrestle with the border troops of the Shinwu dynasty who had retreated back to the Central Plains. Li Zhong shook his head helplessly and smiled bitterly. The Northern Army can't even gather 600,000 soldiers, and they have to be stationed in different places in the northern frontier. It's a chaotic time. Who knows how many demons and monsters are going to cause trouble? Almost all the bright gown guards are going to fight with the army. The local troops and the Association of Demon Kings can't suppress the northern frontier. Besides, Li Zhong stopped abruptly. He waved his hand and said, "Anyway, the northern army can't be mobilized. Within 4 hours, you have to bring me at least 100,000 soldiers. Otherwise, the guards of the royal palace will go out to fight. Even if we can't kill all the border army of the Shinwu dynasty, we have to try our best to wipe them out." As soon as he finished speaking, Li Zhong's face was so gloomy that it was about to drip water. Some words couldn't be heard by a mere guard. The northern frontier wasn't a paradise where everyone was united. There was a lot of blood hidden under the peaceful land. Various factions wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to fight for enough benefits for themselves. Although they had all given up on the position of the actual ruler under Lin Yuan, this did not mean that they were pure of heart and did not care about anything. It was like the aristocratic families that depended on the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce to survive. How could the Qiao family and the Shui family be compared with the other aristocratic families? Although the forces that depended on the northern frontier were controlled by the factions and wouldn't think about being the leader, they would take this opportunity to suppress and scheme against each other because of their irreconcilable hatred. Even if they were punished afterwards, they would still do it. These actions were the same as the forces that rebelled in the Shinwu dynasty. It was just that they didn't have the resources and strength to stand on their own in the northern frontier. They could only drag down the forces of the other factions and try their best to eliminate more forces to increase their own speaking rights. Usually, the northern frontier looked peaceful on the surface. However, at this critical moment, no one could be sure whether they were loyal or not. Li Zhong didn't know who he could trust. He could only let them work together according to their original factions and try his best to avoid infighting. However, there were some ticking time bombs that he had to guard against. For example, Zhang Qilin. The guard had a bitter expression on his face. He could only helplessly accept this task before turning around and leaving the office. He didn't have as many misgivings as Li Zhong. Naturally, he didn't have as many worries as Li Zhong. However, Li Zhong was now their master. Once Li Zhong fell from power, they could forget about having good days in the future. I really envy you guys. You don't have to think so much. Li Zhong looked at the guard who was gradually walking away and shook his head with a bitter smile. However, a moment later, Li Zhong's face returned to its cold and indifferent expression. However, a trace of madness appeared in his eyes. Didn't you, Lei Qiuxing, want to play an open scheme with us and turn the area around the imperial capital into a place where anyone who touches you will have to stab their hands with blood? This old man doesn't believe in this evil. While you're organizing a defensive position, this old man will do his best to eliminate the effective forces in your hands and let those Shuangjin barbarian people bleed first. Let's see if you can still sit still on the fishing platform. Li Zhong's strategy wasn't weak. However, he didn't have Lei Qiuxing's boldness. However, this didn't matter. Even a rabbit would bite when cornered. If he couldn't find a way to deal with Lei Qiuxing's open scheme with his own courage, then he might as well give up on his reasoning and use an absolutely bold and crazy strategy. In any case, Lei Qiuxing dared to act as if he was going to drag the northern frontier down with him. How could the northern frontier not dare to accept this? However, on the surface, Lei Qiuxing wanted to drag the northern frontier down with him. However, he still had a trump card in his hands. It didn't matter even if he didn't achieve the desired effect. In any case, Lei Qiuxing was extremely confident that he would still be the ruler of the Shinwu dynasty. He wouldn't become a speck of dust in the long river of history because of a small disturbance. However, Li Zhong's crazy response was just a risky move. To put it bluntly, it was just a bluff. In his heart, he really did have some thoughts of dragging Lei Chuxing down with him. Chapter 503. But it doesn't matter. After all, I still have the Dragon King behind me. The madness in Li Zhong's eyes gradually subsided. Lei Chuxing had some unknown trump cards in his hands, but how could Li Zhong not have any trump cards in his hands? The situation had already become so dangerous, but Lin Yuan didn't show any signs of panic. He didn't even have the intention to recall the army in the south back to the northern frontier to fight together. That must be because Lin Yuan still had other cards that he hadn't played yet. Li Zhong knew his position, so he also knew that no matter how much power Lin Yuan gave him, he was still a puppet. And no matter how much a puppet struggled, it was still within the scope of Lin Yuan's ability. As long as Li Zhong wasn't stupid enough to cancel Lin Yuan's original arrangements and order all the troops in the northern frontier to die, then Lin Yuan would still be able to clean up the situation. There was indeed only one ruler in the northern frontier, but Li Zhong, as the king of the northern frontier, still had a lot of power in his hands. In addition, Lin Yuan deliberately molded Li Zhong into a positive figure who always thought for the common people. Anything that was beneficial to the people in the northern frontier would be credited to Li Zhong. The dirty work was basically done by people like Luo Su, Shi Dong, and Xia Siyu. This was because Lin Yuan was very clear that the law of the jungle could be absolutely observed in the Hengduan Mountains. But outside the Hengduan Mountains, when dealing with these people, he had to consider everyone's feelings from all aspects. For example, those capable officials who had real talent, hated war, and could really bring benefits to a region would definitely not be willing to serve under a warmonger like Lin Yuan. After all, Lin Yuan's actions were completely different from the ideals they had molded since childhood. Naturally, they wouldn't favor him, but the development of the northern frontier couldn't be done without them. Therefore, Li Zhong appeared. With Li Zhong as the leader, it was a completely different matter. Not just the people on the northern frontier, even the arrogant sages of the Confucian sect mentioned the reforms on the northern frontier. Even though they knew that they were growing on the corpses of the noble families and sects, they did bring benefits to the people. They even removed the opportunity for the noble families and sects as middlemen to suck the wealth of the people. The people received benefits, and so did the income of the rulers. Therefore, no one could go against their conscience and say that the reform of the northern frontier was a strategy to bring chaos to the country. Even though they all knew that the reforms and laws at the northern frontier were all made by Lin Yuan, the exotic beast, they still couldn't believe it. However, since Lin Yuan wanted to give the credit to Li Zhong, these humans agreed to it. They were willing to be blind and not come out to refute. Naturally, there would be talented people who didn't see the twists and turns in the process who came to the northern frontier. Therefore, Li Zhong's position in the northern frontier was very special. Different from the previous two kings of the northern frontier, although Li Zhong didn't have his own faction, his orders carried much more weight than the previous two kings. This was because he was assigned for Lin Yuan to recruit talents. Even if Li Zhong wanted to die, Lin Yuan had to find a way to protect him. "I hope you won't walk on that path of death." Li Zhong placed his hands behind his back and sighed faintly. The situation at the northern frontier was indeed complicated. However, Zhang Qilin and Shenlin Jun, who used to be reserve soldiers, were even more difficult to deal with. These people were 100% loyal to Lei Chuxing. When Luo Su was teaching Li Zhongxing, Lin Yuan promoted Zhang Qilin and let him lead those people to build the northern army. Therefore, Li Zhongxing was under the subtle influence. His loyalty to Lei Chuxing was no longer what it used to be. This time, Lei Chuxing's action of no building without destruction had greatly impacted Li Zhongxing, who had been nurtured in the northern frontier. Therefore, Li Zhongxing, who was far away in the front line, might not be absolutely loyal to Lin Yuan. However, when it came to protecting the people of the northern frontier, Li Zhongxing would spare no effort to complete it. Therefore, the Great Wall plan would never have any mistakes. However, Zhang Qilin, who had been hanging out with those old brothers, wasn't affected by this. These people still maintained absolute loyalty to Lei Qiuxing. Since Lei Qiuxing could bypass the intelligence agencies of the northern frontier and move the border army to retreat under their noses, then it was impossible for him not to bypass their spies and send the secret edict to Zhang Qilin. At this critical moment, it was better to be stabbed by someone from the inside than to fight against those barbarians of the Shuangjin dynasty. Li Zhongxing stayed in the northern frontier as a prisoner because he wanted to keep an eye on Zhang Qilin and those old subordinates of Li Zhongxing. However, now that Lei Qiuxing had taken such drastic measures, only an idiot would let those border army soldiers leave. However, if he moved, no one could guarantee that Zhang Qilin wouldn't act rashly. Before this, the northern frontier's troops were all sent from the northern battlefront army. Of course, it wasn't because the soldiers of the northern battlefront army were strong and had good training. It was because Lin Yuan didn't want Zhang Qilin and those reserve soldiers of Shen Lin Jun to make the northern battlefront army into a private army. That was why he wanted to use this method to scatter those officers of Shen Lin Jun's reserve soldiers into different troops so that they couldn't cooperate with each other. Two flowers bloomed, one on each side. Let's not talk about the scheming in the northern frontier for now. Li Zhongxing, who was near Donglin City, wasn't having a good time at the moment. Because of the Shenwu dynasty's border army's retreat, the original barrier naturally didn't exist anymore. Although the Shenwu dynasty's army wouldn't go deep into the northern frontier's territory, they wouldn't come near the border and cause trouble near Donglin City, which was heavily guarded. However, even if the Shenwu dynasty's army didn't come, it didn't mean that the Shuangjin dynasty's barbarians were so sensible. As soon as the border army retreated from the fortifications, the barbarians rushed in impatiently. After all, the border army had been ordered to defend the defensive line for the past few days. Not to mention supplies, even the scouts couldn't penetrate the defensive line. Therefore, the 1.2 million Frost Mirror barbarian from before had completely lost contact with them. Now that things had developed to this point, it wasn't just a matter of the missing 13th prince anymore. If the 150,000 Blood Gold Knights were wiped out here, even Frost Mirror Khan wouldn't be able to stop the decline of the Blood Gold tribe, let alone the 13th prince. If the 1.05 million cavalrymen were also lost, who knew how many tribes would be wiped out this winter? Because of this, the chiefs of the Shenwu dynasty's territory were extremely anxious. They repeatedly ordered the northern frontier to release these warriors even if they had to suffer some losses. Therefore, more and more Frost Mirror barbarian rushed into the Shenwu dynasty's territory like wolves and tigers, urgently wanting to get in touch with the vanguard troops. Chapter 504. Previously, Li Zhongxing had used a different strategy to eliminate the vanguard troops, so he could treat them as if they did not exist. But now that the Great Wall plan was halfway through, if he allowed this large wave of barbarians to pass through, the entire plan would become a joke. Moreover, even if these barbarians were not very smart, it was impossible for them to allow the northern territory to build a defensive fortification that could isolate them from their territory. Damn it, let's go all out. Li Zhongxing unsheathed the long sword at his waist and said fiercely, "Don't panic. Craftsmen, finish your work in an orderly manner. My men will escort you back to the safety of Donglin City in an orderly manner. Leave 5,000 men to guard the craftsmen. The rest of you, follow me and prepare to fight those barbarians." Almost all of the soldiers following Li Zhongxing were the elites of the southern expedition. Apart from the first batch he had brought out, the rest were all veterans who had participated in the encirclement and suppression of the rebel army in the north. Although the quality of their battle was not up to par, they had still been honed on the battlefield. These soldiers naturally exuded the aura of an invincible army. The Shuangjin barbarian army arrived in an instant, but they did not break through the enemy's formation and charge immediately. Instead, they set up camp 15 li away from Donglin City, seemingly intending to engage in a tug-of-war with Li Zhongxing's headquarters. This was the first time the two sides had met. Even the arrogant Shuangjin barbarian army did not dare to be careless at this moment. After all, the 13th prince, 200,000 blood-ridge cavalrymen, and 450,000 cavalrymen from various tribes had all been lost in the north. Now that the brothers who had invaded the Central Plains had regained contact with them, those who had entered the northern territory were like clay oxen entering the sea. It was as if they had disappeared directly. Given the barbarians' character of bullying the weak and fearing the strong, even if they had not personally experienced the battle with the Northern Frontier Army, they would still realize that the so-called information about the Northern Frontier being weak was all fabricated by the Xinwu dynasty to deceive them. The one who was truly weak was the Xinwu dynasty. However, now that things had developed to this point, the Mirror Frost dynasty did not have the spare energy to cause trouble for the Xinwu dynasty for the time being. After all, their brothers, as well as the 13th prince, whom the Khan had placed all his hopes on, were all trapped in the north. If this matter was not handled properly, the Mirror Frost Khan would be enraged, and countless heads would roll. Both sides had merely set up a battle formation and were facing each other. Unexpectedly, neither side had any intention of taking the initiative to attack. The first day slowly passed by in this kind of stalemate between wanting to say something but hesitating to do so. It was not until noon of the second day that a rider came out of the Shuangjin dynasty's military tent, claiming to be the messenger of the Khan of Frost. Li Zhongxing's camp was built behind the cement wall. Because the fortification had just begun construction, even with the help of cement, it was impossible to complete it in a short period of time. Moreover, this fortification was only outside Donglin City and had not yet been connected to the planned cities. Naturally, the Shuangjin barbarian did not know that this was the wall of despair that they would encounter in the future. It was just a temporary fortification built by the Northern Frontier Army. The ranger in charge of guarding the place held the so-called messenger on the ground and carefully searched him. After making sure that he did not carry any weapons, he was escorted into the main camp to meet with Li Zhongxing. After entering the commander's tent, the messenger did not mock Li Zhongxing with a sneer on his face. Instead, he cupped his fist with a solemn face and said in a deep voice, "I am Kai Ting, the young chief of the Green Carp tribe in the Frost Mirror grassland. Greetings to all the generals." The moment his voice fell, all the generals in the commander's tent looked at each other in dismay. Then, their eyes fell on Li Zhongxing's face at the same time. It was said that the Shuangjin barbarian was rude and unreasonable. But now, this messenger had changed his usual behavior. There must be something fishy going on. "I am Li Zhongxing, the commander of the southern expedition in the northern frontier." Li Zhongxing sat on the tiger-skin chair, looked down at Kai Ting and said in a deep voice, "The Shuangjin dynasty started the war without declaring war. First, they attacked our northern frontier territory. Now that the army is here again, the young chief has changed his usual behavior. This is really confusing." Hearing this, Kai Ting blushed. He cleared his throat and said, "There is something you don't know, Marshal Li. Our Shuangjin dynasty was deceived by a scoundrel. We didn't know that the northern frontier and the Xinwu dynasty had broken off relations. That's why we attacked the northern frontier territory. I'm sure you also know that our Shuangjin dynasty and the Xinwu dynasty have been at war for more than half a year. When we suddenly saw a hole in our border, we naturally wouldn't let go of this opportunity." Kai Ting's words weren't nonsense. After all, the northern frontier belonged to the Xinwu dynasty. Although the Frost Mirror barbarian clearly came for the northern frontier, they didn't penetrate the northern frontier, let alone enter the territory of the northern frontier. In addition, the Frost Mirror barbarian had come for the Central Plains. So, if they braced themselves and said that they came to attack the Xinwu dynasty, no one could say anything about it. Oh! Li Zhongxing suddenly understood and raised his head. He smiled and said, "Young chief means that you attacked the wrong people?" Yes, yes, that's what I meant. Keiting's face was still red, but it wasn't clear whether it was due to excitement or embarrassment. Li Zhongxing's face suddenly darkened. He said in a strange tone, "Young chief is so sure of this statement. Do you think that I and everyone else are fools? If our northern frontier army entered the Shuangjin dynasty and killed, and then we told you that we were actually going for the demon beasts in the Hengduan mountain range, would you believe us?" As soon as he finished speaking, the generals in the tent suddenly burst into laughter. Keiting's face became even redder. After all, they had all watched the Shuangjin barbarian invade the north. They didn't even look at them, who were disguised as the Xinwu dynasty's troops, and directly rushed to the northern frontier. If the Shuangjin dynasty really came for the Xinwu dynasty, how could they let go of the cities and troops in the north? Donglin City was intact, and they were unharmed. This was a ruthless slap to the Shuangjin dynasty's face. This is not the same. Keiting's face alternated between green and red. He whispered, "Your northern frontier army can directly enter the Hengduan mountain range. Why do you need to use our frost mirror grassland?" Li Zhongxing smiled and shook his head. He mocked, "Then why can't your frost mirror cavalry gather their forces and directly attack the central plains and take over the imperial capital? Why do you have to divide your forces to attack our northern frontier territory? You can divide your forces, but can't we?" Keiting's chest rose and fell violently. He stared fiercely at Li Zhongxing, but he couldn't spit out a single word. In terms of sharp tongues, even 100 of him wouldn't be a match for these people. But now, he had to lower his head. Chapter 505. You're being bullied to this extent and you're still not angry. As Li Zhongxing mocked Kei Yen, his eyes flashed with a sharp light as he began to secretly plan. The Shuangjin dynasty hasn't changed much, but they also have experts on their side. They know that Lei Chuxing wants to use them to clean up the families and sects of the Xinwu dynasty and suppress us at the same time. When the matter is almost done, Lei Chuxing will make his move. At that time, those Shuangjin barbarian in the south of the Xinwu dynasty won't be able to come out. Therefore, they can only set their sights on the northern frontier, hoping to liberate their forces from our side and ensure that the Shuangjin dynasty won't be greatly damaged by Lei Chuxing's scheme. After all, after this matter is over, many forces will want a share of the profits. Suddenly, Lin Yuan's voice interrupted Li Zhongxing's contemplation. Li Zhongxing looked around and didn't see any signs of Lin Yuan's existence. He then heard Lin Yuan say, "I'm talking directly to you through my consciousness, so only you can hear my voice. You don't need to find out where I am. Just deal with the matter at hand and try to stall for time. Wait for our people to kill the Frost Mirror Barbarian in the northern frontier, but don't deliberately cause a conflict." With Lin Yuan's support, Li Zhongxing's thoughts inexplicably calmed down. Clearing his throat, Li Zhongxing said with a smile, "Young clan leader, you don't need to take it to heart. I'm just complaining. If it were you, young clan leader, you wouldn't easily swallow this resentment after being beaten up for no reason, right?" "Yes, I don't know what request Commander Li has. Please tell us. The Shuangjin dynasty will do our best to satisfy you." Seeing that Li Zhongxing was giving him a way out, even though Keiting had been humiliated to the point of wanting to die, he had no choice but to pinch his nose and agree. However, this time, Keiting emphasized the words reflection of the Frost dynasty. He wanted to remind Li Zhongxing that he was not alone. There were still millions of reflection of the Frost cavalry outside. If the two sides could not come to an agreement, they would have to fight. If the two of them had a normal conversation, Li Zhongxing might have to think twice before bargaining. However, with Lin Yuan's support, Li Zhongxing no longer had any desire to negotiate. This was because Lin Yuan never intended to give him any face from the beginning. In the end, they would still have to fight. After pondering for a moment, Li Zhongxing's lips curled up slightly. He smiled and said, "Young clan leader, you're too polite. I'm just a commander. Even if I want to negotiate, I'm not qualified. How about this? Young clan leader, go back and rest for 2 days. I'll quickly send a letter to the Northern Frontier Mansion and let the king of the Northern Frontier count the casualties before coming back to talk to young clan leader. Although Kai Yen was smiling, he was cursing in his heart. Of course, he knew that Li Zhongxing's rank wasn't high enough to negotiate with them. However, as one of the 3 commanders of the Northern Frontier, Li Zhongxing's words still carried a certain amount of weight on the Northern Frontier. More importantly, Li Zhongxing and his men were currently at the pass. As long as he didn't agree, his brothers trapped in the north wouldn't be able to come out. They wouldn't even be able to send in supplies. Who knew how many people would die in these 2 days? Licking his lips, Kai Yen asked tentatively, Commander Li, I came here with sincerity. However, I don't see any sincerity from your side. How about you open a path and let the warriors of the Shuangjin dynasty who mistakenly entered the northern frontier return home? Humph. Almost instantly, Li Zhongxing heard 2 cold snorts. One voice came from Lin Yuan, and the other voice came from a middle-aged scholar in a gray robe in the tent. The middle-aged scholar cupped his fists toward Li Zhongxing, then looked at Kai Yen with a gloomy face and said in a cold voice, Warriors. Those barbarians may seem like warriors to you, but in the eyes of the northern frontier, they are complete sinners. This young master, your Shuangjin dynasty wantonly invaded our northern frontier, committing all kinds of crimes. Now that you see that the situation isn't right, you send someone over to say a few words and want us to let them go. Isn't the price of invading our northern frontier a little too low? You are. The corners of Kai Yan's mouth twitched as he gloomily stared at the middle-aged scholar. After all, Li Zhongxing's army was blocking the path that they had to pass through. No matter what, he was a mountain that could not be bypassed. The Shuangjin dynasty did not want to waste their military power in such a meaningless place, so they naturally had to say all they could. However, if it was someone else who came to talk to him, he would not be so good-tempered. If it were not for the fact that this middle-aged scholar was Li Zhongxing's subordinate, he would have already brandished his blade and cut him down. Chen family of Taizong, Chen Zifang. The middle-aged scholar coldly stared back at Kai Yen without the slightest hint of panic in his eyes. Chen Zifang was a traitor on the side of the aristocratic families during the rebellion of the 3 cities. He might not be first-rate in terms of cultivation or strategy, but his insight was unparalleled. From the moment the northern frontier prince's residents began to carry out military orders, he understood one thing: Lin Yuan had no intention of letting go of the Shuangjin dynasty's cavalry that had entered the northern frontier. In other words, Lin Yuan's original intention was to completely fall out with the Shuangjin dynasty. With such a style, either Lin Yuan was not worried about the Shuangjin dynasty's revenge, or he had something that could threaten the Shuangjin dynasty. Coupled with Li Zhongxing's current attitude, how could Chen Zifang, who had already seen through everything, not jump out and make his presence known in the eyes of the Dragon King? Never heard of you. But then again, you don't have the right to talk to me. Kai Yen disdainfully shook his head and sneered, Do you think that the Shuangjin dynasty is weak and easy to bully just because I say a few words? Do you really want us to break into this weak camp of yours and hold our swords to your necks before you're willing to talk? The Shuangjin dynasty's soldiers were used to being rude. After Kai Yen finished speaking, he felt that he had finally vented the anger in his heart. Especially after he finished speaking, the generals in the tent no longer dared to say anything else, especially the more timid ones. At this moment, a thin layer of cold sweat had even seeped out of their foreheads. Seeing this scene, Kai Yen felt even more confident. After all, not wanting to lose manpower was one thing. The main reason the Shuangjin dynasty's army was willing to stop and negotiate with Li Zhongxing was because this army was at its peak and had an oppressive aura. Once the 2 sides started fighting, the Shuangjin dynasty's army might not be able to gain much of an advantage. But now, he realized that although the soldiers below were full of fighting spirit, the generals who made the decision might not have the courage to fight to the death with the Shuangjin dynasty. Clang! Before Kai Yan could feel smug for long, Li Zhongxing stood up from his tiger-skin chair and drew his personal guard saber. He walked over to Kai Yan with a majestic gait, his eyes blooming with killing intent. Since young clan leader has said so, then let's talk after we fight. Chapter 506. As soon as Li Zhongxing's challenge ended, the generals and strategists in the tent no longer hesitated. They all stared at Kai Tang like hungry wolves as if he was a piece of juicy pork. Just being stared at by the generals made Kai Tang break out in a cold sweat. He originally thought that these generals of the southern expedition were unwilling to go to war with the dual sword dynasty. However, after Li Zhongxing spoke, their sudden change in attitude revealed the problem. They weren't afraid of going to war with the Shuangjin dynasty. Instead, they were worried that the crime of going to war with the Shuangjin dynasty at the northern frontier would fall on their heads. By then, no matter who won or lost, there would be rivers of blood on both sides. Whoever started the war would be the sinner. Now that Li Zhongxing had taken on the responsibility, they naturally didn't have any scruples. After all, they were all soldiers. Kai Tang could also understand the attitude of the generals of the southern expedition. If they didn't go to war, how long would they have to endure before they had the chance to be promoted? Marshal Li, you'd better think this through. The Reflection Frost dynasty has come with sincerity. As long as you release our people, we can negotiate any compensation you want. But if you insist on not giving way, we'll carve out a path of blood to bring our brothers home even if we have to kill you. Kai Tang swallowed his saliva as he sensed the shocking killing intent from Li Zhongxing. His face turned slightly pale. Putting aside the fact that his cultivation wasn't as good as Li Zhongxing's, even if he could defeat Li Zhongxing in a one-on-one fight, there were still the generals of the northern frontier and close to 1 million soldiers of the southern expedition. What was the difference between wanting to kill his way out of this military camp in his unarmed state? Li Zhongxing stopped and rubbed the tip of his nose. He sneered and said, it seems like young clan leader is afraid. Nonsense. Kai Tang's face turned red again. He suppressed his voice and said, the men of the Shuangjin dynasty aren't afraid of anything. It's just a misunderstanding between us and the northern frontier. Now that we're willing to apologize, why must Marshal Li be so overbearing? Do you think Marshal Li will still have a good reputation if we fight? Clang! Li Zhongxing flicked the blade in his hand, pointing it straight at Kai Chen as he fiercely said, young patriarch, are you mistaken? Right now, it's the Shuangjin dynasty that's invading the northern frontier. I'm just protecting the country. I didn't send people to invade the Frost Mirror grassland to create friction. The Shuangjin dynasty was the one who started the war. Now, you're the ones asking for peace. Young clan leader can't be so naive as to think that we, the people of the northern frontier, have no temper, right? As soon as he finished speaking, the entire tent was filled with chaotic shouts of killing. The northern frontier was slightly better, especially the cities near the Central Plains. At the very least, they could be nourished by the Central Plains caravans. However, the living environment of the northern frontier wasn't much better than the Frost Mirror grassland. The only thing that could attract the caravans to bring all kinds of necessities to the northern frontier was a large amount of spiritual items and demon flesh. These were precious materials that were worth tens of thousands of gold taels in rich places. Therefore, if the people of the northern frontier wanted to survive, they had to learn how to identify all kinds of spiritual items from a young age. In the process of harvesting spiritual items, they had to fight demon beasts. Therefore, in terms of bravery and bloodthirstiness, the people of the northern frontier didn't lose to the people of the Frost Mirror grassland. Most of the people following Li Zhongxing were veterans of the southern expedition who had been trained from the northern frontier. The remaining veterans were also the first troops to follow Li Zhongxing. All of them had lived in the extreme north of the Shenwu dynasty. Facing the dangers of survival day after day had never moved these men. Was the Shuangjin dynasty trying to scare them by sending their cavalry in that direction? Hearing the incessant shouts of killing, Caitian felt a buzzing in his head. He didn't know where he got his quick wits from, but he gritted his teeth and roared, "Marshal Li, I have to admit that your troops are brave, but as the marshal, aren't you being a little too reckless? The enemy of the northern frontier isn't the Shuangjin dynasty, but the Xinwu dynasty across the river." Li Zhongxing slowly raised his right hand. Only then did the shouts of killing stop. Gulp. Caitian swallowed, feeling his throat dry. He continued, "I think, whether it's the king of the northern frontier or the Dragon King, neither of them wants to face the Shuangjin dynasty's troops while fighting the Xinwu dynasty, right? Continue to bicker with him. Drag it out for as long as you can. In any case, none of the people who invade the northern frontier will live." Suddenly, Lin Yuan's voice rang out in Li Zhongxing's mind again. Li Zhongxing's lips curled up slightly. He looked at Caitian with a kind expression and laughed. "Didn't this marshal say that I'm not qualified to speak with the Shuangjin dynasty? This marshal isn't high enough to discuss this matter with the Shuangjin dynasty. If you really want to talk, then let's wait for 2 days and do as His Highness says. Is that all right?" Although Caitian's expression was unsightly, Li Zhongxing was already pointing a blade at him. He naturally knew that he couldn't go too far. Otherwise, this fellow really wouldn't mind fighting with them. After all, the northern frontier's current thinking was that they were protecting their country. The responsibility of starting a war didn't even fall on them. But if they fought, the merits would be theirs. Caitian nodded with some difficulty and said helplessly, "Everyone, let's both take a step back. Before we reach an agreement, we won't ask you to release our brothers trapped in the northern frontier, but we ask that you provide them with supplies." Chen Zifang sneered and said to the general next to him, "Hey, Li Zhen, have you ever heard of a burglar breaking into your home and then having to provide him with food and water after holding him down with great difficulty?" "Never heard of it." Like his name, Li Zhen looked burly and powerful, but he had a sharpness that didn't match his appearance. He didn't hesitate to cooperate with Chen Zifang and said with a smile, "In my hometown, when you catch a burglar, you don't even need to send him to the officials. Just beat him to death." Caitian's expression darkened as he looked at Chen Zifang and Li Zhongxing. Before he could say, "I've tolerated you for a long time," he felt Li Zhongxing's blade getting closer to his neck. He could only bitterly say, "I know this request is a bit excessive, but those brothers can't just eat and drink, can they? Since Marshal Li also believes that this is a misunderstanding, why should we expand the conflict? If it really doesn't work, we can just send supplies to those brothers inside. Is that not enough?" Li Zhongxing lightly shook his head and said with a cold face, "Before His Highness's decree, your troops are not allowed to advance an inch. Otherwise, we will treat it as a declaration of war." At this point, Li Zhongxing glanced at the smiling Chen Zifang. Seeing that the latter was slowly becoming serious, he said in a low voice, "But your troops can give the prepared supplies to me. I will arrange for people to send them to the rear." Caitian's brows furrowed and he couldn't make up his mind. Chapter 507. In the end, Caitian chose to give in and agreed to send the supplies to the Southern Expedition's camp. However, he also proposed to send some cavalry with good cultivation to transport the supplies. Firstly, he wanted to ensure that these supplies would not be used to support the enemy. Even if the Southern Expedition wanted to take these supplies, they might not be able to kill all the cavalry. If 1 or 2 escaped, the 2 sides might go to war. The consequences were not something Li Zhongxing could bear. Secondly, he wanted to see for himself the condition of the grassland warriors who had lost contact with the Shuangjin dynasty and see if they were still worth saving. After all, they were now asking for peace with the northern frontier. This was equivalent to exchanging real money for the warriors trapped in the northern frontier. It was similar to the trade of people within the Shuangjin dynasty. The attitude of the northern frontier was obvious. Caitian did not think that the northern frontier's appetite would be small. Even the extremely wealthy Bloodbath tribe would have to fork out a huge sum of money to exchange for the Frost Mirror cavalrymen, not to mention the tribes that the cavalrymen originally belonged to. According to the rules, the tribes that the cavalrymen originally belonged to would have to pay at least 40% of the cost. If this amount of wealth was distributed to the various smaller tribes, it would be an astronomical sum that would suffocate them. Although the Frost Mirror grassland did not lack resources, due to the special living environment, they did not only trade animal meat, spiritual items, and other goods that were widely circulated everywhere. The extra people would also be treated as trade goods. If their own tribe could not afford to raise them, they would be sold to other tribes that had more resources but fewer people. As for their status, it was not a problem that the original tribe had to worry about. As for the remnants of a defeated army, they were clearly not worth the Mirror Frost dynasty's investment. How cruel! The corners of Li Zhongxing's mouth twitched slightly. His eyes were somewhat hazy. As a future top military officer of the Shenwu dynasty, he naturally knew what Ke Ting's actions meant. However, this did not mean that he could understand Frost Mirror's barbaric actions. In his opinion, if his fellow soldiers and comrades had fallen into such a situation, he would choose to save those who might still be alive no matter what the price was. He would also try his best to send the bodies of the dead back to their hometown for a proper burial. Unlike Frost Mirror Man, who regarded his compatriots as a resource and only traded with them when he could gain benefits from it, Frost Mirror Man did. If they were in the same predicament one day, would they be disgusted by their fellow soldiers' actions? After Ke Ting left the camp, Li Zhongxing waved his hand and dismissed all the generals and staff officers in the commander's tent. In order to prevent a troop from becoming the personal army of the commander, Li Zhong carefully divided each troop into different battalions. Every 10,000 men could form a battalion, and each battalion had a battalion commander, a deputy commander, and 3 staff officers. Including the mid-level and low-level officers, any battalion of the 3 armies of the northern frontier could almost snowball into a huge army without falling into chaos. Although the battalion commanders and deputy battalions were all outstanding graduates of the military school of the Northern Frontier Academy, their backgrounds were completely different. Some were grassroots generals promoted by Lin Yuan from poor families, while others were descendants of aristocratic families who had submitted to Lin Yuan. As for the staff officers, one was from the Demon Emperor Association, while the other 2 were guests of Li Zhongxing and Qin Hu of the Genie Guards. It could be said that each faction was stuffed into a battalion to check and balance each other. No matter what the characters and abilities of these people were, they all had their own factions behind them. Naturally, it was impossible for them to get along well. After all, everyone had their own interests. Only very few people would believe in feelings and loyalty. Of course, in order to prevent each faction from harming their comrades for their own interests, Li Zhongxing also adopted a system of punishment. For example, once disobeying orders, the battalion commander, deputy battalion commander, and 3 staff officers would not be able to escape. It was fine if it was impossible, but if anyone was determined to drag down the northern frontier, before facing the anger of Lin Yuan and Li Zhongxing, they would still have to wrestle with the other 4 big shots. Unless all 5 of them were determined to betray the northern frontier, just the difference in strength alone was enough to send those disloyal fellows to hell. It was also because of this system of appointment that although Li Zhongxing was nominally the commander of the southern expedition and could mobilize any unit, he could only give a general strategy and detailed battle objectives. The degree of completion and the plan of completion were all discussed by his subordinates. If Ke Ting had not come to the meeting as an emissary of the Shuangjin dynasty, the northern frontier generals and staff officers would never have gathered in Li Zhongxing's tent. Now that the meeting was over, even if Li Zhongxing did not ask them to leave, they would not stay here for long. After all, no one knew when the war would start. If they had the time to chat here, they might as well go back and sharpen their weapons. Dragon King, I'm not doubting you, but I feel that your way of doing things is no different from playing with fire. After everyone had left, Li Zhongxing casually threw his saber to the side and sat down on his tiger-skin chair. He said in a deep voice, "Since you don't intend to negotiate with these barbarians, you shouldn't keep them in suspense. Now that things have come to this, it's really not easy to end things." Lin Yuan's projection slowly condensed in Li Zhongxing's commander's tent. A cold glint flashed in his different-colored eyes as he sneered, "I want to use the fate of these barbarians to tell everyone that no matter what schemes they have behind the scenes, if they don't have the determination to fight to the death with the northern frontier, don't interfere. Otherwise, this king will directly chop off their hands. Do you think it's better to settle things once and for all, or to drag things out slowly?" At this point, Lin Yuan paused for a moment and said, "The Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce has indeed brought in a lot of profits. Before this, it could almost support the simultaneous operation of several projects. But after the war started, 2/3 of the reform and construction projects in the northern frontier were suspended, and all the money squeezed out was used to fund the various troops. Because of this, the various departments still owe the soldiers their salaries. Although the equipment from the Ministry of Works and the Ministry of War has been equipped with all of you, they have only paid you a portion of the cost of the materials. They still haven't paid you the labor fees and salaries." A string of black lines slowly appeared on Li Zhongxing's forehead. Of course, he knew that war cost money, and a lot of it at that. For example, the Xinwu dynasty had been peaceful for decades. Even if the officials were greedy, the treasury was still considered rich. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Lei Qiuxing slept on a mountain of gold every day. But how long had it been since the war on four fronts started? The treasury of the Xinwu dynasty had basically been emptied. Chapter 508. After all, you're a general now. You can't think in such a simple way. Theoretically, I should only pay you the salary of the South Expedition Army. Actually, you should be concerned about the expenses and rations of the surrendered troops and captives. However, I still paid the bill for you. As of now, your South Expedition Army is growing larger and larger in scale. Did I tell you to stop?" Lin Yuan sat up and said calmly, "Anyway, I don't want to fight the Xinwu dynasty and the Shuangjin dynasty slowly. If you want to let these people go, you will have to fight at the front when the Frost Mirror Barbarian invades next time. Also, don't expect me to pay you a single cent outside of the establishment." The corner of Li Zhongxing's mouth twitched slightly. He held back the swear words that were about to come out of his mouth. He didn't have the national treasury of the Xinwu dynasty that had been peaceful for decades, nor did he have the terrifying beast that was the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce. If he had to support an army of millions of people, wouldn't that be asking for his life? But Lin Yuan's attitude was very clear. He didn't want to fight this war. Whoever wanted to fight would pay. Li Zhongxing wanted to complain about this kind of rascal behavior, but he didn't know how to say it. After all, the Southern Expedition's military strength was several times greater than the establishment that Lin Yuan had given him. And as the work of cleaning up the Northern Territory continued, this number was still increasing. When the war was over, they would definitely be dealt with. But Li Zhongxing didn't want to be forced into a dead end because of this matter. Then if all 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian soldiers are lost at the northern frontier, how should we deal with it? Now that the Shuangjin dynasty has taken the initiative to beg for peace with us, it seems that they are prepared to bleed a lot. But not only did the Dragon King not give them face, his actions are no different from starting a war. If they really go to war regardless of everything, it will be no less than a disaster for our northern frontier. Li Zhongxing cupped his fist at Lin Yuan and said in a deep voice, "Am I right?" Li Zhongxing, who was disgusted by Lei Qiuxing's action of abandoning the people in the Northern Territory, couldn't tolerate sand in his eyes now, especially after experiencing the good life of the people in the northern frontier. Li Zhongxing couldn't be said to be loyal to anyone now. The only thing he wanted to protect was the people in the northern frontier who had sacrificed everything for their livelihood. Lin Yuan said that he wasn't willing to go to war with the Shuangjin dynasty, but at the same time, he was provoking the Shuangjin dynasty. He couldn't figure out the meaning behind this at all, so he could only look at Lin Yuan with a confused gaze, hoping to get an answer. If Lin Yuan really decided to go to war with the Shuangjin dynasty at the critical juncture where the Xinwu dynasty was about to launch a counterattack against the northern frontier, then Li Zhongxing would summon those loyal to him to launch a military remonstrance even if it meant risking his life, forcing Lin Yuan to give up this bold idea that shouldn't have existed. The northern frontier alone was enough for them to digest for a long time. Not to mention that Lei Chuxing still had the strength to spare. Even if he could kill Lei Chuxing in one blow, the northern frontier wouldn't be able to take down the remaining central plains and southern territories. So Li Zhongxing is right. You still have room for improvement in strategy, but in terms of strategy, you're just a chicken. Lin Yuan looked at Li Zhongxing with pity, helplessly shaking his head, and explained, "Right now, we're not the ones fighting a war. I'd rather use these military funds to develop the northern frontier and even the entire northern territory than waste them on such meaningless things. You're also one of the people with the highest status in the northern frontier. You should know how much work we still have to do and how much resources we lack." Hearing this, although Li Zhongxing didn't like the way Lin Yuan looked at him like he was an idiot, he still nodded to show his agreement. If Lin Yuan really was a warmonger, he wouldn't waste time researching the new laws of the northern frontier. He also wouldn't exterminate the sects and then punish the noble families. He also wouldn't take all the land in the northern frontier and rent it to the people for farming at a very low price. At the same time, he would establish the Northern Frontier Academy and a series of huge projects related to people's livelihood, medical care, and other fields. Just by relying on the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, it wasn't impossible for Lin Yuan to cultivate the northern frontier into a war-loving land where everyone was a soldier. However, Lin Yuan's choice was to slowly develop and gradually reform. Every move might not be beneficial at the moment, but it would definitely be beneficial for the future. If there were really so many resources that he didn't have any place to use them, Lin Yuan would definitely carry out more projects and build more gathering places so that every inch of land in the northern frontier could be used properly. He wouldn't train an army to compete with the Xinwu dynasty. Although it looked like Lin Yuan made the first move, in reality, Lin Yuan's purge of the northern frontier was Lei Chuxing's idea. The situation had developed to this point because Lei Chuxing didn't want Lin Yuan to easily take over the northern frontier. It would be best if he acted like a tool and wiped out the rebellion in the northern frontier. After forcing the southern frontier to make a move, he would obediently retreat to his own northern frontier. However, Lei Chuxing wasn't the only tyrannical person in this world. Lin Yuan, who was able to come up with God's mandate and King's law, was no less tyrannical than Lei Chuxing. However, Lei Chuxing didn't have the boldness to lie by the side of the bed and allow others to sleep soundly. From the beginning, he only wanted to use the northern frontier as a test subject for the reform, so that the hostility of those aristocratic families and sects would be transferred to us. However, now that the northern frontier is strong, Lei Chuxing can no longer let us continue to grow. Once we take over the northern frontier, the speed of our development will definitely rise to another level. At that time, the extremely weak Xinwu dynasty might not be able to be destroyed at any moment, but the outcome would already be determined. Therefore, the battle between the Xinwu dynasty and the northern frontier will happen sooner or later. It's just a matter of waiting for us to be fully prepared before attacking, or Lei Chuxing taking advantage of the fact that we haven't stabilized our footing yet. For an outstanding military strategist like me, Lei Chuxing's actions weren't out of my expectations. On the contrary, I didn't expect the Xinwu dynasty to be so weak. Therefore, I'm more and more worried about what kind of trump card he has in his hands. Under these circumstances, our own wishes don't matter at all. Right now, the Reflection Frost dynasty has changed their ways and is humbly begging for peace with us. It's not because of the reasons they've given us, but simply because they don't want to fight. Therefore, whether we teach them a lesson or not, they won't fight. Or rather, they won't choose to fight to the death with us right now. Do you think they will be grateful to us if we let those barbarians go? Lin Yuan's eyes flickered with an obscure brilliance. It was as if he was looking at the frost mirror Khan from countless miles away and seeing through his heart. His tone was even more certain than guessing. Chapter 509. Isn't that the case? Li Zhongxing's eyes widened. If all 500,000 frost mirror cavalrymen are killed, it'll be a blood feud. Those barbarians will never let it go. They'll have to go to war eventually. Your actions will definitely bring the war forward. Li Zhongxing felt that the more he listened, the more confused he became. It seemed that Lin Yuan was right, but his reason told him that this was all sophistry. Lin Yuan definitely had other plans behind his back. After such a huge feud, even if Frost Mirror Khan didn't want to go to war with Lin Yuan, those tribes would definitely force him to send troops to the northern frontier. After all, only some of them were unlucky now. Once the war started, the northern frontier and the whole Shuangjin dynasty would be in trouble. Even if it was for the survival of their own tribes, most of them would choose to go to war. Frost Mirror Khan is like a wolf. Before they're full, they'll keep following you. When you show a weakness, they'll pounce on you and tear your flesh apart to fill their stomach. If you don't want to, you can only raise your weapons and beat them until they're scared. Only then will they tuck their tails between their legs and show their more dog-like side. They'll stay away from you and won't dare to provoke you for a while. If we show weakness now, the Shuangjin dynasty won't be grateful to us. Instead, they'll think that the northern frontier is only strong on the outside but weak on the inside. After they've healed their wounds, the first thing they'll do is to invade our territory and burn, kill, and pillage. By then, it'll be an endless war. Mirror Frost had fallen into Lei Qiuxing's trap. Not only were the 700,000 Mirror Frost cavalrymen trapped in the Central Plains unable to come out, even more Mirror Frost cavalrymen would be trapped in this deadly trap. Based on this battle alone, I am certain that at least half of the Shuangjin dynasty's border army near the Shenwu dynasty will be destroyed. Apart from the border army, the tribes near the Shenwu dynasty will also lose many young and strong men. Of course, we weren't the only ones who knew that Lei Qiuxing's concession was a trap. The Shuangjin dynasty knew it too. The reason they wanted to make peace with us was to preserve their strength as much as possible so that they wouldn't lose too much of their strength. They might even lose the edge of the Frost Mirror grassland so that their ranch could become our hunting ground. If both sides worked together in the beast tide in the Hingduan mountain range, the Shuangjin dynasty might not even be able to recover from the setback. Speaking of which, if we can't determine the victor between us and Lei Qiuxing, then we need a way out. Therefore, the Shuangjin dynasty's invasion this time is a way for us to ease our relationship. At that time, we can choose to call a truce and head north together to collect this debt of blood from the Shuangjin dynasty. Then, we can return to our respective territories and start accumulating strength for the next war. But this time, if we sign a truce, we won't have an excuse to head north to attack the Frost Mirror grassland. Naturally, we can't join forces to attack the Shuangjin dynasty. Even if we shamelessly call a truce, the other dynasties won't just stand by and watch us attack the Shuangjin dynasty. If they cut off the trade with the Northern Territory Chamber of Commerce, we won't even have a place to cry. So, they only need to withstand the pressure from Lei Qiuxing. Lin Yuan narrowed his eyes slightly and smiled. I don't want the northern frontier to fall into a two-sided war. I just want to tell these barbarians one thing. The northern frontier will never back down from a fight. As long as they want to fight, I'll fight with them. Plus, there's a special tribal system there. Before we can catch our breath, Shuangjin Khan's throne will probably change hands. Do you think that Shuangjin Khan, who has dominated the grassland for 50 years, will do such a profitable business for a bunch of dead people? This, Li Zhongxing's eyes widened even more. He said with a puzzled expression, since the Shuangjin dynasty has already seen through the trap, won't they know to withdraw and wait for the right opportunity? They'll attack us when we fight with Lei Chouxing. No matter who they help, or whether they fight on both sides, they'll still benefit from it. That's what we need to do. Fan the flames, add oil, let this fire burn even more fiercely. Let the Shuangjin dynasty suffer the greatest loss and force them to swallow their anger. The coldness in Lin Yuan's eyes slowly faded and turned into an obscure emotion. I'm slow-witted. I don't understand what the Dragon King means. Li Zhongxing shook his head with a bitter smile. However, he was sharp enough to smell the blood in Lin Yuan's words. In the end, weren't they still going to fight? Sophistry indeed. The loss of 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian is not an unacceptable loss for the Shuangjin dynasty, because the number of young men who die from the cold, starvation, or being killed by demon beasts on the grassland is far more than that. However, for some tribes, the loss of these young men is a disaster. They won't accept this result easily, so they'll do everything they can to recoup their losses. For example, 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian died on the northern frontier, but 700,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian killed and looted as they pleased in the Central Plains. If they want to recoup their losses, do you think it's better to start a war with the northern frontier, or go to the Central Plains, where they think it's incomparably prosperous, and even plunder for a while more in the south? If we show enough strength, the Shuangjin barbarian will wisely choose to avoid us and hold this grudge in their hearts for the time being. However, in the current situation, their first choice is still to plunder the Shenwu dynasty. This wise decision is what both Lei Chouxing and I want to see. The only ones who want to stop them are the higher-ups of the Shuangjin dynasty. However, the tribes that have suffered losses won't let go of such a good opportunity, especially the small and medium-sized tribes outside the range of Frost Mirror Khan's influence. Even if they pretend to be obedient, they won't let go of such a fat piece of meat like the Shenwu dynasty. Lin Yuan's voice trembled as he said, Lei Chouxing used the bones of countless people to build a path to victory for himself. In this aspect, he's even more of a bloodthirsty demon beast than this king. But you also said that the Shuangjin dynasty already knows that this is a trap. Before Li Zhongxing could finish his words, his face turned pale and he swallowed dryly. He suddenly realized that Lin Yuan, this demon beast, knew more about the situation of the various factions than he, a professionally trained officer, did. The unique tribal system of the Shuangjin dynasty was no different from that of the demon beasts in the Hingduan mountain range. However, the beast Lord Kirin could intimidate countless demon beasts, but the old Frost Mirror Khan didn't have such strength. Although he was revered as the king of the grassland, the small and medium-sized tribes outside the range of the Blood Liao tribe's influence had never obeyed Frost Mirror Khan's orders. Chapter 5:10. The harvest of 700,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian in the Central Plains was enough to make most of the Frost Mirror tribes jealous. It was also enough to drive the tribes that had suffered heavy losses crazy. Even if the Frost Mirror Khan ordered them not to enter the Shenwu dynasty's territory, they wouldn't listen. Lin Yuan's act of killing 500,000 Frost Mirror Barbarian was equivalent to pouring oil on Lei Chouxing's trap. The fire that wasn't strong enough to begin with instantly engulfed more than half of the Frost Mirror grassland. And this was an overt scheme. Unless the Shuangjin dynasty was willing to start an all-out war with the northern frontier, they could only choose the seemingly weak Shenwu dynasty. This king isn't as ruthless as Lei Chouxing, but this king loves his own people more than Lei Chouxing. Lin Yuan finally regained his composure and said with a smile, no one knows what Lei Chouxing's trump card is. This king doesn't want him to use it on the northern frontier. It's better to send him more Frost Mirror Barbarian. When he can't hold on anymore, he'll naturally reveal his trump card in advance. I know what to do. Li Zhongxing nodded with a serious expression. No one knew what Lei Chouxing's trump card was, but in this situation, unless Lei Chouxing went crazy, he definitely had something that could change the situation in an instant. Letting Lei Chouxing use this thing on the Shuangjin barbarian was obviously much better than using it on the northern frontier. Although he didn't like this kind of scheme, it wasn't his own doing. However, this wasn't his doing, and it was indeed for the sake of the entire northern region. Therefore, even if Li Zhongxing didn't like it, he could only persuade himself to accept and even obey. The next morning, Kai Yan led 30 Shuel Yao cavalry and 200-plus carriages of supplies, his face solemn as he arrived at the Southern Expedition's scouting area. After yesterday's meeting, Li Zhongxing had no intention of stopping him. Very quickly, he led the 5,000 light cavalry to the front of the formation. Marshal Li looks a lot more energetic. Kai Fan rubbed her hands together. She had dark circles under her eyes, and it was obvious that she hadn't rested well. In fact, Li Zhongxing had also gone through a lot of mental struggles last night. But after thinking it over, she still decided that Lin Yuan's actions were the most beneficial for the northern frontier. It was also the best way to break Lei Chuxing's trap. At the very least, it was the method with the least losses. So, for the latter half of the night, Li Zhongxing didn't continue to brainstorm with herself and fell asleep peacefully. But looking at Kai Yan's appearance, Lei Chuxing knew that this young clan leader of the Green Fish tribe didn't have a good time after returning home yesterday. The arrogant and unreasonable Shuangjin dynasty had lowered their proud heads, but they didn't get the respect they deserved from the northern frontier. The situation they were facing was completely different from what they had expected. Not only did the northern frontier not show the slightest bit of fear, they even seemed to be full of fighting spirit. But even if the northern frontier wanted to fight, the Shuangjin dynasty didn't. They only wanted to preserve their strength and wait until the northern frontier and the Xinwu dynasty had a decisive battle before coming to take advantage of the situation. There was no need for them to help that bastard Lei Chuxing fight the vanguard after falling into his trap. At least, that was what the generals of the Shuangjin dynasty convinced themselves. But according to Kai Yan's report, the northern frontier didn't plan to release the captives immediately. They wanted to send the message back and wait for the reply from the northern frontier prince's mansion before deciding on their next move. Before that, they couldn't even send their supply wagons past the southern expedition's position. They could only send some cavalry to accompany the southern expedition to transport the wagons. In the words of those scholars, the behavior of the northern frontier was no different from being shameless when they were given face. But they couldn't do anything because, just as Lin Yuan had predicted, the Shuangjin dynasty didn't plan to fight this battle. So, they could only vent their anger on Kai Yan, the envoy. As a result, Kai Yan looked like he was going to collapse at any moment. Li Zhongxing glanced at Kai Yan and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I didn't expect young clan leader to be so knowledgeable about the situation of our brothers trapped in the northern frontier. 500,000 Frost Mirror barbarian soldiers wasn't a small number. These 200 wagons of supplies were only enough to fill the gaps between their teeth." Although the defense line of the northern frontier wasn't that tight, the intelligence network formed by the Association of the Demon Emperor's members and the embroidered uniform guards wasn't something that the Shuangjin dynasty could infiltrate. So, the Shuangjin barbarian soldiers who were still defending the plains definitely hadn't made contact with the main forces. So, Kai Yan's 200 wagons of supplies were just a pretense. At the same time, it was also to express his distrust of the northern frontier. Kai Yan smiled helplessly and wiped the sweat on his forehead. He said with an apologetic smile, "Marshal Li must be joking. Just by looking at your southern expedition, I know that the northern frontier's army isn't ordinary. We know our own strength. How could those good-for-nothings be a match for your northern frontier's army? Let alone 500,000, even if they had 200,000 left, they would be burning incense to thank the gods." At this point, Kai Zhuo paused for a moment before continuing, "We're just going to take a look at the situation today. Although the supplies we brought are better than nothing, they should be able to last for half a day. Once we confirm the situation, we'll be able to make preparations." Li Zhongxing expressionlessly pulled on the reins and turned his horse around. He said coldly, "I'll say the ugly words first. Your cavalry had better behave themselves. If they do anything inappropriate, I have the right to kill them on the spot." Also, after confirming the situation, you can prepare for the next shipment, but all of your cavalry will have to come back with you. Do you understand this? Understand my ass. Kei Yan's face suddenly darkened. He didn't expect Li Zhongxing's slap to come so quickly and so suddenly. They had prepared such a small amount of supplies in order to annoy Li Zhongxing and make his men make a few more trips. Of course, there was no lack of distrust in Li Zhongxing. They were worried that the southern expedition would seize too much of the supplies, which would be considered an act of aiding the enemy. But Li Zhongxing's attitude was also very clear: you don't trust me, and I don't trust you. You think I'll seize your supplies? I think you're using this method to increase your troops. But then again, both sides were just trying to annoy each other. They didn't really suspect each other of doing anything. After all, the supplies were only enough to fill the gaps between Li Zhongxing's teeth. Even if Li Zhongxing seized them, they would only be able to fill the gaps between their teeth. With the troops around him, they could eat all 200 carriages of supplies in 1 or 2 meals. Although the dozens of cavalry were all in the late stage of the airborne realm, such a small number of people was definitely not enough to increase the number of troops. What was the difference between increasing the number of troops in such a scale and sending them to their deaths? Chapter 5:11. Marshal, what should we do with the frost mirror cavalry that came with us? A light rider rode up to Li Zhongxing, a faint murderous intent flashing across his fair face. The fair-skinned young general was a graduate of Qiao Yu's batch. However, unlike Qiao Yu, who was known as Black Bear due to his simple and honest nature, Qiao Yu was known as the Black Bear, which made him the type of general who would charge and break through enemy lines. On the other hand, the fair-skinned young general, Zhang Shuzhu, was more of a scholarly general. His training was decent as well, having reached the pinnacle of the airborne realm before the age of 30. He was only one step away from reaching the celestial star realm. Li Zhongxing was also one of the military mentors of the Northern Frontier Academy. Qiao Yu and Zhang Shuzhu were both students that he thought highly of. Although they had their own shortcomings and were not as good as Qin Yu and Zhao Guangchong, who were taught by Lin Yuan and were able to lead troops to the south as soon as they graduated, he still wanted to get closer to Li Zhongxing. To be fair, Zhang Shuzhu was not worse than the students taught by Lin Yuan. He could become a famous general after some training. However, his biggest weakness was hatred. Zhang Shuzhu's parents were both civilians. They did not even have the ability to move to other places to live, let alone have the ability to cultivate. Therefore, every year when the Frost Mirror Barbarian raided the border, Zhang Shuzhu and his parents could only rely on luck to avoid being killed. However, luck would always run out. When Zhang Shuzhu was 7 years old, the Shuangjin dynasty raided the border. His parents were killed by the sword, and only the young Zhang Shuzhu escaped by hiding in a secret cellar at home. Since then, the seed of hatred had been planted in Zhang Shuzhu's heart. Lin Yuan set up the Northern Frontier Academy and supported poor students. This was a great opportunity for Zhang Shuzhu, and he did show his extraordinary talent. Compared to the children of aristocratic families who grew up with spiritual objects, Zhang Shuzhu, who started cultivating in his 20s, could not achieve much. However, there was no limit to human perseverance and potential. Zhang Shuzhu, who had a blood feud, was far more hardworking than the other students in the same batch. His cultivation, the art of war, and even strategy were all excellent in almost every subject. However, when everyone thought that Zhang Shuzhu could win Lin Yuan's favor and become the most dazzling star of the northern frontier in the future, this guy rejected Lin Yuan's olive branch without hesitation and went straight to the main camp of the southern expedition. From Zhang Shuzhu's point of view, it was impossible for the southern expedition army to continue south in a short period of time. However, the cleanup work in the north still had to continue. Apart from those clans that were still stubbornly resisting, the Frost Mirror Barbarian cavalry that pillaged the border would be the Southern Expedition Army's main opponent for a very long time. And Zhang Shuzhu was indeed capable. After a series of tests, Li Zhongxing believed that this guy, who was not much younger than him, would become the most dazzling star of the northern frontier in the future, even if he rejected the recruitment of the so-called star general class. Therefore, even though he knew that Zhang Xiuzhu was currently on the southern expedition, he would divide the southern expedition in the future and take part of the people to form a new army to wrestle with the Shuangjin barbarian. Li Zhongxing gladly accepted Zhang Xiuzhu as his disciple and even trained him as his successor. However, Zhang Xiuzhu's performance in the past 2 months had indeed proved that he deserved Li Zhongxing's favor. In response to this proud disciple's question, Li Zhongxing only raised his eyelids and said through secret voice sending, "The Shuangjin dynasty has 35 cavalry with them this time. Apart from the heavy military supplies we have, you can only take 50 people with you. How do you think we should deal with them? Kill them." A cold light bloomed in Zhang Xiuzhu's eyes as he replied without hesitation. Li Zhongxing was silent for a while. Zhang Xiuzhu scratched the back of his head and said with a smile, "Marshal is not a person who makes arbitrary decisions, but with your authority, it's not impossible for you to let the Shuangjin barbarian go. However, you chose to stall for time without discussing with us. This action already shows that Marshal has no intention of letting those barbarians go. Moreover, you're not the only one who has an opinion on this matter." "Ha!" Li Zhongxing smiled noncommittally. He just waved his horsewhip gently, indicating for Zhang Xiuzhu to leave. Just as Lin Yuan had said, Li Zhongxing was a chicken when it came to strategy. His current actions could only deceive the Shuangjin barbarian. However, those in the southern expedition with discerning eyes could see that Li Zhongxing, who had always followed the advice of others, had chosen to use stalling tactics to cut off the Frost Mirror barbarian's chances of survival. It was obvious that someone was guiding him behind the scenes. And although Li Zhongxing was the king of the northern frontier, he only had the authority to make suggestions. He did not have the authority to directly command the commander-in-chief of the northern frontier's 3 armies. If it was Li Zhongxing's idea, then Li Zhongxing would still have to discuss it with them before deciding whether to do it or not. That was why the entire southern expedition was so quiet. No one argued with Li Zhongxing like Li Zhongxing did with Lin Yuan. The reason was very simple. Most of them were already scared out of their wits by Lin Yuan. Lin Yuan had never tasted defeat since his debut. Therefore, they could not see the depth of Lin Yuan's decision. Even if they could see it clearly, no one would overestimate themselves and ask Lin Yuan to correct it. When Zhang Xiuzhu gradually rode away, Li Zhongxing once again said through secret sound transmission, "Just say that it was my idea. Go to that place and pick a group of ruthless people to go with you. First, lead them around in circles. After you have shed all pretense of cordiality, you must do it cleanly. Don't leave any hidden dangers." Speaking up to here, Li Zhongxing paused and smiled. Besides that, Wei River City has been breached, and there are still over 100,000 reserve troops of the Divine Forest Army gathered near Zhangtao City. We can't clear them out for the time being, but we have to let these Frost Mirror barbarians vent their anger, right? This general will not disappoint the Grand Marshal. Zhang Xiuzhu pulled on the reins and turned his head to look at Li Zhongxing. His white face squeezed out a bright smile. As for how to use these 200 carriages of supplies to provoke the conflict between the Frost Mirror barbarian and the Shenlin Jun reserves, he had already outlined a rough plan in his mind. At the same time, he also guessed what Black Zhao, who gave him today's position and opportunity, was planning. Kei Ting stared blankly at the 2 people's lips moving. He subconsciously felt his heart sink. But when he listened carefully, he could not understand what they were talking about. Although they were speaking the common language of Tianwu continent, the words they spat out were all numbers. For someone like him who did not know the code of the northern frontier, it was no different from listening to a heavenly book. But his keen sense of danger still made him feel that the southern expedition was secretly planning something. Chapter 5:12. Young clan leader, why are you in a daze? Li Zhongxing urged his horse to the side of the hesitant Kei Ting and lightly poked him with the end of his whip. Only then did Kei Teng wake up from his deep thoughts. His entire body seemed to have been startled, and cold sweat began to appear on his forehead. That was my favorite student, but his personality is a little weird. He doesn't know how to speak the common language of the Sky Marshall continent, so we were using a special secret signal to communicate. I told him to go back and pick 50 capable brothers to escort you on this trip. Is there any problem on your side? Kei Teng finally calmed down. When he looked at Li Zhongxing again, he discovered that he was smiling warmly. Gently shaking his head, Kei Teng forced himself to calm down and said, "But I heard that the northern frontier isn't very peaceful right now. Can 50 people really escort the supplies safely to the destination? Why don't we discuss it again and have both sides send more people?" When he heard the number 50 people, the stone in Kei Teng's heart slowly fell. After all, the cavalry of the northern frontier couldn't be compared to the cavalry of the Shuangjin dynasty. Even the horses they rode were inferior warhorses bought from the Shuangjin dynasty. Even if their cultivation was higher, 50 people against 35 people might not have more than a 50% chance of victory. And even if they could defeat them, it was impossible to keep all 35 of them at the northern frontier. As long as one or two escaped, the northern frontier wouldn't be able to take it. Even Kei Teng, who had always believed in his intuition, felt that he was being too cautious, and even a little oversensitive. Li Zhongxing lightly shook his head and bitterly smiled. To be honest, although there are many hidden dangers in the northern frontier, the real threat is the Frost Mirror Cavalry and Shenlin Jun's reservists that we couldn't completely eliminate. With your people here, even if we bump into the Frost Mirror Cavalry, they won't do anything. And if we encounter those reservists, even 2,000 people won't be able to do anything. But if the number of people is smaller, the target will naturally be smaller, and it will be much safer. Kei Teng stared blankly at Li Zhongxing. Shenlin Jun was the trump card of the Shenwu dynasty, and was also the trump card of Lei Qiuxing's dragon throne. Even the reservists were quite a formidable existence. Furthermore, Wei River City, which was known as the Impregnable Fortress, was also a famous existence. But now, the reserve force of the Divine Forest Army had been defeated and even Wei River City had been breached. What kind of monsters were these people? Thinking of this, Kei Teng's last trace of hostility towards the northern frontier completely dissipated. He bitterly smiled and said, "If that's the case, then we'll do as the Grand Marshal wishes. I'll go inform them to prepare to depart." Although the men of the Shuangjin dynasty didn't lack courage and bravery, the special living environment still made them have the personalities of wolves and dogs. Just as Lin Yuan predicted, the stronger the northern frontier displayed, the more the Shuangjin dynasty didn't want to provoke the northern frontier. But Kei Teng, who was just about to leave, suddenly remembered something. He abruptly pulled on the reins and said, "Our 13th prince was deceived by the Shenwu dynasty some time ago and led his troops into the northern frontier's territory by mistake. It's been almost half a month since then. I wonder if our 13th prince is a guest at your residence." Although the third prince speculated that the 13th prince was dead, the proud Shuang Jianren didn't think so. In their eyes, the northern frontier was just a group of nouveau riches. They might not even be able to withstand the counterattack of the Shenwu dynasty. How could they offend the Shuangjin dynasty at this time? Therefore, even if the 13th prince went on a killing spree in the northern frontier, he only needed to announce his identity after he was defeated. Not only would the northern frontier not dare to touch him, they would even treat him as a guest of honor and wait for the Shuangjin dynasty to take him away. "Young master, you must be joking. I haven't heard any news about the 13th prince." The warm smile on Li Zhongxing's face instantly disappeared. He said coldly, "I will write another letter to ask the northern frontier's residents. However, I advise you not to have any delusions about this matter. You know our Dragon King's personality. The Shuangjin dynasty has sent troops to invade the northern frontier one after another. If they don't pay a price, they will lose face. Kating originally thought that taking the 13th prince out was just a matter of convenience. After all, they could let the 500,000 frost mirror barbarians go. If they let a few more people go, they wouldn't be criticized. However, Li Zhongxing's cold attitude was telling him to stop dreaming. The Shuangjin dynasty would definitely pay a price for these two invasions. Between the 500,000 frost mirror barbarian and the 13th prince, he could only choose one. I still have military matters to attend to. Farewell. Without waiting for Kai Yan to quibble, Li Zhongxing cupped his fists and urged his horse to rush towards the army camp. He's trying to sow discord. When Li Zhongxing disappeared from sight, Kating threw the horsewhip in his hand to the ground. Between the 500,000 frost mirror barbarians and the 13th prince, this was a choice that even a child could make. However, when it came to Kating, he couldn't make up his mind. Not to mention that among the 500,000 cavalrymen trapped in the north, at least 60,000 of them were Green Fish clan's disciples. The other clans who had lost some of their men were all hoping that their men could return safely. Because of this matter, Kating, the envoy, was treated with great respect. Gifts that Kating didn't even dare to think about before were prepared and sent directly to his tent. There were even some tribes that used beauty traps. Their goal was to make Kating protect as many of their tribe's men as possible. Once Jueqi gave up on the 500,000 frost mirror barbarian cavalrymen and chose to bring the 13th prince back to the imperial court, he would be tied to the Blood Liao tribe. Once the Blood Liao tribe collapsed, there would be no place for the Green Fish tribe to stay in the prairie. If Kan Shuang had been young, it would have been fine. Unfortunately, Kan Shuang had been seriously injured when he was young. His cultivation had not improved in the past few years, and his body was deteriorating day by day. There was no telling when he would pass away. Although there were many outstanding princes in the Shuoliao tribe, the most outstanding ones were the 3rd and 13th princes. Of the two of them, one was a scholar and one was a martial artist. If these two forces could not be merged together, the decline of the Bloodstream tribe would be inevitable. But from what he knew, the relationship between the 3rd prince and the 13th prince could be said to be irreconcilable. However, if Kating chose the 500,000 frost mirror barbarian and gave up on the 13th prince, then what awaited him would be the fury of the Bloodspan tribe. Those tribes wouldn't care about his friendship. In the eyes of the prairie people, they had already prepared a generous gift for Kating. Kating bringing back their tribe's young men safely was his duty. Only a fool would fall out with the Bloodstream tribe in order to protect Kating.